They don't believe that there ever was a God, or that there is a God, aside from man himself. And man has not reached that state yet, but can, and this is what they teach in the lodges, that if you perfect yourself as the temple of the God within and become Christed, you've all heard this in the New Age movement, you too can become God. In her movie, Running on the Beach, spinning around, I am God.
This is Bristol. It's Friday, it's 5 o'clock. Welcome to Not the BCFM Politics Show on the 7th of June 2024, streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft Arts Centre in Bristol, ye olde Templar Port in the Empire of Lies now. We're on the talkradio.org.uk stream at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, and DJ Plug Radio in Nuneaton live. Also on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores. Aurora, please, not Google Play. I keep hearing reports that the app works really well, and do you know why? It's because Nick, who's the developer of the app, is such a superb chap. In fact, he even turned up at the end of last week's show and gave us a bunch of beers, because he's in the UK. He's normally over on the continent, but very nice of you. Thanks ever so much for that, Nick. Really appreciated it. And Martin's even managed, I've even didn't drink them all week, and passed on some to Martin tonight. He's very chuffed too. I'm Tony Gosling. Thank you for turning off the psycho in the corner, gaslighting us with its military-grade propaganda, psyops, the puff pieces on the conspirators, and the hatchet jobs on the heroes, the McCarthyite witch hunts going after anyone with influence who speaks up for humanity or against the World War III wage slavery lies. With those with eyes to see and ears to hear, these so-called solutions to every crisis, Gaza, Ukraine, COVID, migrants, farming, cost of living, are designed to make every crisis worse. Well, maybe elections, that's supposed to be a solution too, isn't it? And the politicians have nothing to say. Nick Land's behaviourist dark enlightenment drones the cowards and control freaks want to slave to their machines. Pike's World War III slugfest relies on your blind obedience. Meanwhile, wife-murdering pantheist Wef King Tampon Charlie and witch queen Camilla wage war on the British people, as well as China, Russia and the BRICS, with Libya regime change maniac sidekick Diddy David Cameron lending a hand. So, helping us navigate the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution, the Fourth Reich Matrix, and of course the Empire of Lies, is Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. And joining us in the studio this evening is Palestine activist Shakir Yildirim. So tonight the party's campaigning for 2.5 weeks so far without manifestos. What's going on? So they're going to decide at the very last minute to tell us what their manifestos are. And maybe this is because there's all sorts of negotiations going on, and they're not really that interested in whether we think that they should have a manifesto at the start. They don't have any principles. They're adjusting their manifestos as to what they think they can get away with, and quite possibly sitting down with potential donors and saying, do you want this in the manifesto or not? Thanks very much, Uniparty and other parties. So, are the alternatives to the Uniparty, the Greens, Reform and the Lib Dems, putting voters' concerns about war, zero carbon or poverty first? So you can get an idea of that through some of the TV debates, which we'll be looking at this evening. But we will not be having great long extracts from the TV debates, maybe one or two, maybe even not. Because what I'm much more interested in is some of the fringe parties and just discussing the general election itself. In part two, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, a charade ceremony. The warmongering, quizzling Zelensky is given pride of place, but the Russians, around 50 times more World War casualties that they took than the Brits, are excluded. And we'll be talking a bit about Dieppe, which was a precursor to D-Day on the 19th of August 1942, and how Winston Churchill and his private secretary Desmond Morton, presumably King George VI as well, sabotaged Dieppe to make it look as if it was much more difficult to get a foothold. And this was 2 years before D-Day. The idea is to send a notice to the Russians, oh, it would be so difficult for us to join the war, you're going to have to fight Hitler on your own for another 2 years, sorry. So that's Dieppe we'll be looking at tonight, as well as Paul Craig Roberts on nuclear war from the puppet states, Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan. That threat, of course. Iranian and Russian news banned in the UK, first by the telecoms cartel, then by Ofcom. Us cancelled off Bristol Community FM by the Bristol Mafia, but not cancelled here yet. Anyway, Shakir, welcome. It's a long time since we've spoken to you.
Thanks.
Can you just give us an idea of when I spoke to you when we were on FM, on BCFM, a long time ago,
right,
when you were involved in, I think it was in a flotilla to Gaza?
That's right, yeah. Marvin
So
Marmara.
what persuaded you to do that? I mean, because you were working, I think, doing in the food industry or something. Could
Well,
just
I was.
take us from that to
I
how you
was.
decided to go to Palestine.
Well, that was first time was there was a march in Bristol. It was quite a big one. That was back in 2008. It was a Viva Palestina. That was me always listening to the Palestine stories from when I was a little boy. My granddad was listening to obviously he was interested in what was going on some years ago. And then when I first joined that meeting anyway, so then there was this convoy going. I thought, why can't I go? So I decided to go and buy an ambulance, so they wouldn't add me to the convoy.
So hang on, you can't just drive down to. Was it to the West Bank you were going, or Gaza?
No, Gaza.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can't. I did in the end.
Did you?
Oh yeah.
You made.
Oh.
So what was okay? So what were you doing in Bristol that you gave up to go? Because not everyone can just up sticks and go and do something like that. It takes quite a lot to leave everything behind.
What was going on in Israel? In Gaza at the time, they were killing children and women, and there was white phosphorus bombs there.
But what were you doing here in Bristol that you left behind?
Oh, I had a kebab van. Later, it's the council decided to end my licence when I got back from Marvin Marmara.
Oh, that's nice of them.
Oh, yeah.
So that would be under the Lib Dems, probably.
Probably,
yeah. So, okay, so from kebabs to... What was in the ambulance?
We got our Turkish community here. So I told them that I bought a ambulance and that I was going. And when I asked George Galloway's convoy, and the people said, well, you're too late. So I thought, well, I Googled it, how to get to Gaza. So when I looked, I didn't go through North Africa. So through Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and into Egypt, then just drive across. But it wasn't that easy. I read someone's blog. He wrote exactly the problems, where the problem was, and even the boat crossed to Egypt from Jordan. So I did that. When I got to Jordan to Egypt, they stopped me and they said, you can't go. Called the British Embassy.
Hang on. So this is the Egyptians stopping you?
Yeah.
Okay, so hang on. Is there a sea in between Jordan and Egypt? I don't think so.
Yeah, there is.
Is there?
Jordan to Egypt. There's a Red Sea.
Oh, the Red Sea.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
all right, down the bottom. Okay.
That's right, yeah.
So was it a ferry or...
Ferry.
Yeah.
They say they sail at 12 o'clock. It ends up leaving about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, well, that's the same in many parts. In fact, in this country as well quite a lot of the time nowadays. Okay, so what was in the ambulance?
Oh, I had clothing, a bit of medicine, just like loads of kids' toys, a bit of everything really, and so made it there and handed over to hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital at the time.
So how did you get through? The Egyptians said stop?
Well, they stopped me and they kept me there for 2-3 days. I contacted the British Embassy. They said nothing we can do. So I actually had a row with the lady who answered the phone, ambassador or whatever it was. I said, how can you not help me while the kids are, getting killed there? They need this ambulance. I mean, it's probably not going to do anything, one ambulance at a time, but there were bombing ambulances as well.
Well, no, it will do something, probably.
Well,
I mean, if there's one other ambulances, even if it's they cannibalise it for spare parts, I'm not saying it's in that bad condition, for a working ambulance to suddenly turn up that they can wait and use when they need it, of course that's going to be useful.
Yeah. Then
this is Operation Cast Lead we're talking
that's right,
about, I think, isn't it?
Cast Lead, yeah.
Martin, do you want to say something about the history of this? I mean, this was pretty horrific, but it was nowhere near as bad as what's happening now. But we've had a series of these for over the decades, haven't we?
Yeah, it's what the Israelis in their inimitable fashion used to call mowing the lawn. So once every few years we've got to go in and take out what we regard as the potential enemies, just to keep them under control.
Isn't this a little bit like the idea in Northern Ireland? The Catholics are actually breeding faster than the Protestants, and so the same is going on with the Palestinians. The population is growing and growing.
It's very clear that the Zionists are terrified of Palestinian fecundity, because they're more middle class, they have less smaller families, apart from the very religious Jews who have big families, but they won't go in the army, which is a source of contention within Israel. And ultimately, what's happening in my view now is the ultimate bankruptcy of the Zionist state is being revealed. I think the two-state solution is now dead. They've killed it. Mm-hmm. But that means the state itself will have to be liquidated as we go forward.
But isn't that still official policy in the West, certainly here in Britain, two states?
It is, but it's wrong. And I think the things are moving on, yeah? I mean, I know that's still the official position of the Russians and the Chinese and everybody, because it's still keeping that thing on the table. But in my view, the current Israeli regime have ended that, and ultimately this is going to end. It's already a war. They're talking now about going to attack Lebanon to try and take out Hezbollah. And in the Operation Cast Lead period, they tried to take on Hezbollah and they lost. And Hezbollah are much better than they were then. They've got much better kit. Mm-hmm. They lost thousands and thousands of people fighting in Syria, but they learned loads and they were good anyway. They're probably one of the best fighting outfits on the planet. So the Israelis can't beat them.
So, Shakir, you could tell us a couple of tales from your trip. It's a long way. I mean, how many thousands of miles is it?
From here to, probably about 8,000. 8,000
But you must have had a few adventures along the way, apart from just being told stop by the Egyptians.
Well, I mean, start from Turkey. I was I had a bit of a problem with the ambulance. I got it fixed in Turkey, and then on the way down, I met a group of people. They actually helped me going through into Egypt. I'll come to that later. I met them and I said, when did you leave? It was like, they said on the 14th of February or something. Or was it before? Yeah, 14th of February. And it was like about 10 days. I thought, please come with us, please come with us. I said, no. If you've made it here in 10 days, there's no way I'll go because I'm in a hurry to get there. So then I left them and gone. There's two borders into Syria. They went through one border and I went through the other. So when I got to the border, they said, you need a visa. I said, what? Visa? You need to go back to Ankara, which is, probably 6-7 hours drive. And then I asked one of the lorry drivers there, I said, look, I'm a lorry driver as well. Can you get me through this? How can I do it? He said, let me have a word with the chef there. So he went in, he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Gaza. He looked at me like, are you mad? I said, well, I am. So he said, okay, I'm going to issue you a visa. You can go through. So, yeah, they let me go through. Then got to Jordan.
It's interesting, isn't it? This is the sort of relationship that the lorry driver's got with these guys, because he's going through fairly regularly, seeing them. It's a little bit of some personal connection to help you through on the way.
Well, also political, because you're going to Gaza.
Yeah, and just he said to me, "There's a war going on. Why are you going there?" I said, "Look, I'm taking an ambulance there." So he was okay.
Fantastic.
And in the next border, soldiers wanted to see the ambulance. He says, look, we don't want to search, but can we sit inside?
So they were quite enthusiastic.
Yeah, and then later on, he said, can you wait? And he got and brought somebody higher. And he came, he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Gaza. He looked at me again like a madman or something. He lost his mind. Then he just he just cuddled me and says, thank you. He says, I'm going to help you go through the visa. So he says, give me your passport. He took my passport. He put the visa on, stamped it. He said, are you hungry? Would you like something to eat?
Oh, wow.
Coffee. So I said, I'll have a coffee in it. Whatever he written on the passport, when I got to the other border to cross the Egypt, they were so helpful. Everybody was having problems and paying money.
Oh, yeah.
But when they saw that, and I was just like, I was on the boat.
Well, amazing story.
Yeah.
What about Turkey? Yeah, they're playing an interesting role in all of this. I don't know what were the Turks like back in 2008, because we've seen Erdogan now. I mean, I don't know whether you think how serious he is in defending the Gazans.
Well, I mean, I don't want to say anything about politics, because I really don't like politics, because end of the day, you know what the politicians are like.
But they're doing things like calling up reserves in Turkey.
Yeah.
So they're starting to take this thing a little bit more seriously.
Well, people of Turkey, obviously, they're really hot on this Gaza-Palestine, the conflict. There was somebody got killed. He attacked one of the soldiers in Israel. He got killed. He got shot. He was trying to stab the soldier on the streets of there. And
this is in Turkey?
No, in Israel. He went there for a visit. Yeah. So it shows people are really care about Gaza, and politically.
Well, it's not necessarily going to do the Gazans any favour.
Obviously not, but that was his personal anger or whatever. That was. I'm not saying that was right, but it shows that people are in Turkey really hot on that subject.
Yeah, they're very sympathetic generally, aren't they, towards the Gazans, and a bit annoyed about Israel. Well, I mean, you can understand if you look at the history. In the First World War, the British Allenby, and his. I don't know if they had tanks, Martin. Maybe you know about this, but it was mostly mounted cavalry and stuff, wasn't it?
They had some of the first armoured cars. You see pictures of Lawrence of Arabia swanning around in an armoured car. Because, of course, tanks weren't much use anyway in those days for the sort of warfare they were fighting.
But there's some that say, and it'd be interesting to get your view, I don't know how much you know about the history, but the First World War was largely about actually getting the Ottoman Empire, getting the Turks out of that part of the world, so the British could set up their little Crusader state.
Well, they managed it, haven't they? They put the Israelis there. And they slowly just killed them and take their houses from them. And, I think they're still doing the same thing. I know they're good liars, the Zionists, because being in a prison, and I know, they've taken us as a prisoner, and even on the boat. So I can tell you millions.
Tell us a bit about the boat then, yeah.
Well, I mean, with the boat,
When was that?
That was back in 2010. And, we sailed. Everything was going nice.
From where?
From Turkey, again.
Right.
Obviously, floated a part of the...
What was the boat called, and what was the trip?
It was Marmara. The boat itself.
Marmara.
Marmara, yeah.
Okay, so that is the sea, isn't it?
Yes.
It in Istanbul, around Istanbul?
That's right, it's Marmara Sea.
In between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, there's this little sea called
That's
Marmara.
Right. No, Marmara Sea. The Marmara is blue. Yeah. It's a blue...
Okay. Sounds like a nice place to swim. But anyway, you've got a ship called... No, all right. you've got a ship called the...
Marmara.
Marmara. And you sail from Turkey, so...
That's right.
Did you have, again, supplies for Gaza on the ship?
Oh, yeah. Even I collected money from here for cement for Gaza. So we had the little... a few of us, Roland and others... so we all collected some money for cement, some glass we thought, but and we bought it from Turkey. We put it on the boat to take it there. Some computers, for kids, loads of stuff, and we start sailing, and Israel keep threatening us, obviously. We was watching on the TV on the ship.
So you're getting this on the television or on the radio on the ship?
Television. And also we were getting threatened from everywhere, really.
Well, where else other than Israel?
It's just Israel, but they're threatening from the over the radio, over the TVs, and we keep hearing. We had all emails saying, at any cost that ship will be stopped, so just do not resist and so on. I mean, we wasn't going there to fight anyone because we didn't have any.
Did you have any weapons on there?
Well, weapon? No. It's the only weapon we had was the food for Gazans.
And so how long did it take to get from Turkey down to Gaza then?
Well, we couldn't go there, could we?
Well, you set off, I take it.
Oh, right,
you?
yeah. Well, from on a boat.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just we got onto it, and I don't know. I think it was a couple of days before we got attacked.
Right. So, how far were you from Gaza?
Well, we're in. Well, if you made that morning, we would have been in Gaza. Right. I knew we wasn't going to, because they about 11 o'clock. We start to see some lights following us. So ships.
So this is 11 o'clock at night?
Yeah.
Right.
And I knew they were going to attack because we had...
Didn't you put your foot down?
Oh, well, that was the maximum. I told Captain to just put his foot down there. He said, that's the maximum he does.
Yeah, not too fast, okay.
He was, well, I mean...
These motor torpedo boats. Yeah.
Well, they're torpedo... I think, they were going to, one way or another, they were going to shoot the boat and, torpedo and sink the boat. They were going to do it.
Right, so what happened? 11 o'clock at night this started?
That's right, yeah, we start seeing
They
them.
seem to like them late-night attacks, the Israelis,
Well,
I think,
no,
don't they?
Well, I mean, it's a military thing. I mean, they usually do it like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning because...
They think everyone's going to be asleep. And, can't see them coming.
So
they've got their infrared stuff. Yeah,
exactly, yeah, we've been watched. And so...
The Israelis are quite good, it seems, at killing civilians and attacking civilians.
We know that, so I've seen it with my own eyes, so yeah.
So what happened?
No doubt about that. So I said to my mates, I said, look, I'm going to get some sleep. I'm sure they will. If we see the morning, we will be in Gaza.
You have to have someone on watch. Yeah.
Oh no, we had loads of people.
Yeah,
people wasn't sleeping. Well, I'm a bit more used to the attacks and stuff, so I know what time they will attack. I said, look, I'm going to get some sleep because I don't want to be tired when they actually attacked us. So everybody was looking at me, what? You want to go to sleep? I said, yeah. So I said, well, wake me up. Somebody came around 3 o'clock. I said, get up. They ain't getting nearer. I said, okay. That was it. And the battle started and the helicopters...
Well, you don't really need a battle, surely. I mean, they just board you, wouldn't they? Come alongside.
Well, that's it, yeah. Well, I mean, our battle was to try and survive, to be honest.
So, how did they get onto the ship? Was it just was the waves? Was it wavy? Was it?
No, the sea was quite calm. Yeah. I mean, they start coming with the boats, and so obviously we trying to stop them. Some people was throwing them bottles and stuff, but obviously not going to do anything, is it? So they came up, they couldn't board, so the helicopter came and started shooting, and then everything went pear-shaped.
So the helicopter shooting down at you from a helicopter?
Oh, yeah. And
why was that? Because they couldn't board you because you've been throwing things at them?
Bottles and, I don't know,
whatever.
Shoes. I mean, we didn't have anything. That's the only weapons, our shoes, maybe.
So what happened when they started shooting?
Well, I mean, people got shot, obviously, and injured, and people died, and I helped. There was one guy, I grabbed him, and he was shot, but I couldn't see any blood, but he said, like, he was near enough dead, and so the two of us brought him to a bit more safety into one of those entrances, and he says, like, he couldn't speak. He says, turn me on my side. So when I turned on his side, he was shot from the back, from his lungs. So all of his back was blooded when I saw that. And he passed out, and a few other people came and took him downstairs to get treatment. But I think he was died there and then. And then other person got shot on the forehead. I had a few laser pointed at me. I just hid away from them, and they would just keep shooting on top of the ship. So it was it was a...
Did they actually board the ship eventually?
Yeah, eventually they did, yeah. So, and when Bülent Yıldırım is the IHH person said, look, we're surrendering, so do not attack them and do nothing because we have a lot of casualties. So we surrendered, and the soldier was with his handgun pointing at me from the glass. And I thought, well, will it go through the glass? It depends on the... I was wondering I was going to go around the next person trying to help because he was a bit scared. So he said, don't move, don't move. So I just watched him. So we had to sit down, and they handcuffed us. And then they turned the air conditioning off, and they wouldn't give anyone water. So at any cost, I get up, and I gave water to the injured. And he said, I'll shoot you if you don't stop. I said, shoot me then. Because at that point, I lost it anyway, because people are, all wounded. There's just blood everywhere. And they wouldn't, well, I don't know, I think they're animals.
Well, this is soldiery for you, isn't it? When you've got soldiers fighting civilians, particularly, seems worse in a way.
Well, that's it, yeah, because we got no weapon, we can't do nothing to them, and they wouldn't let even people to go to the toilet. We're just civilians.
So this is still on the ship, is it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So what happened eventually? Did they take you off the ship?
Eventually, yeah. They took everything off from us. All the clothing, anything, jacket like that. So make sure we had nothing in our pockets. I had some money, about £6,000, to give it to the orphans and orphanages and stuff there. They robbed that out of me, and they took our friends' credit cards. Later we found out that they spent in Tel Aviv, bought some electronic goods with their credit cards. So I just call them thieves anyway. So we got.
So what was the death toll on the ship then? How many people were on it, and how many died?
Well, we had about 500 odd people on a different, ships. There was a few ships.
That was a flotilla, right?
Flotilla, yeah. And we had 10 people died, all Turkish citizens, and one of them was a dual citizen, American citizen. He was 18, and about 50-something injured, seriously injured, and some light, grazes and stuff. But yeah.
Martin, how did the Israelis survive the sort of criticism that's going to be around the world of this idea of people trying to bring in aid, ordinary people, being killed for their trouble?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were still outside the territorial waters of Gaza.
That's right, yeah. International waters, yeah.
So, of course, the territorial waters of Gaza don't belong to them anyway. How do the
Israelis, from a sort of public relations, mass media point of view, survive something so horrendous and horrific? In fact, they have survived. They've done rather well, generally, for PR, and in their image is rather, it has been anyway rather good in the West, and it's because the image has been good, it's allowed them to do what they've been doing since October last year.
Well, I think incidents like this, what that tells the Israeli authorities is that they can do this and there are no consequences, because it's just smoothed over, yeah. And they're now emboldened, the situation they're in now, yeah. Because they've done things like this, which should have led to all sorts of all sorts of problems should have come from that. But of course, because Turkey's part of NATO and so on, they can't intervene. They've got their own political issues to resolve with the Americans, the Russians, etc. So they're to some extent neutralised, and they've got a massive amount of money to spend on PR, and they don't mind being caught out lying, because their strategy is, if we just keep on talking, we just overwhelm people's capacity to, like the chap we had on the other week, telling absolutely fantastical stories about what's going on in Gaza. There is no civilian casualties, etc. And it's just, it's the Yiddish word, not a Hebrew word, chutzpah. Chutzpah, cheek.
Well, they quite good liars. I mean, I tell you what happened after once they start taking us from the boat, one by one. They brought loads of children to watch. So it's like, oh, we got the terrorists, we caught them. Our, heroes brought all these terrorists into the Israel. So when we got there, they were trying to take pictures of us and fingerprints and, all the details, whatever they can. But they knew all of us, who we are and where we come from. So I was sitting there. He was asking me questions, and I just said, I wasn't answering them properly. And somebody came and just sat next to me. Are you Turkish? This is in Turkish. I was talking in English. So he says, are you Turkish? I said, yes. Oh, I'm from Turkish Embassy. We've been waiting here since 6 o'clock this morning. We've been waiting for you. But it's all in really clean Turkish from Istanbul. So better Turkish like. I looked at him, he looks pretty Turkish as well. It's nice, clean shaven, and well, just somebody like from embassy. So I said, tell me, where is your ID? I want to see an ID to see if you're from Turkish embassy. Oh, they're taking all of our IDs. They wouldn't allow anyone to come in here. They give us a wristband, something in Hebrew. So I said, I wouldn't believe that he is from Turkish embassy, but his Turkish is a lot better than mine. So I said, what's going to happen then with us? He says, oh, well, if you sign this piece of paper saying that you entered into Israel illegally. I said, well, I'm not. We've been taken here. We're taken hostage, prisoner, whatever you call it. He said, oh, no. He said, if you sign it, then they will send you with the first flight. The flights are waiting there for you. I said, well, what happens if I don't? Oh, they send you to prison. Oh, okay, then. I said, don't worry, I'll go. Can I stay in the boat? He says, what, in that rusty thing? I said, yeah, I'd rather have that I'll stay there. He says, okay. I said to him, you're lying. You're not from Turkish embassy. Why don't you just F off? And he just quickly went. So it shows how professional they are.
Devious, I would say, rather than professional.
Well, maybe, yeah.
Because ultimately this is not very professional. As you can see, look at the Israeli army now. Yeah. Hamas have beaten them. They've killed loads of civilians, but they're still underneath.
Martin, obviously there is... I don't think you could say Hamas has beaten the Israeli Defence Force.
They have, because the Israeli Defence Force have to win. Hamas only have to carry on fighting.
I believe what you say as well, Martin. Yeah, I think they're beaten.
How?
Well,
they thought it would be easy.
Martin, this is a question for Shakir, yeah?
Well, they look at the Israeli army. How many are they? They got everything, haven't they? They got tanks, helicopters, whatever you think of. They're getting from
drones.
Drones, yeah.
They've got computers.
Exactly. I mean, look at Hamas. What they got? Tell me what they got. Just a few silly missiles.
Well, they've got a few anti-tank weapons, I think, haven't they?
Oh well, okay. Well, that's a big thing, isn't it? Oh,
well, not necessarily. It's a handheld thing that will stop a tank.
Well, I think they're quite good on that.
They've developed quite a lot of their own stuff. And of course, what people don't realise is that they're dug in underneath Gaza.
That's right.
Very deep. Very deep down.
Mm.
So they've got a city under there. That's where they are.
Why can't they find it then?
Well, they can't. They found the entrances to it, but they can't go into it because it's too dangerous. Can you imagine? You've got to squeeze down these tunnels, which can be blown up while you're in them because they're all booby trapped.
Well, I bet they can put drones down, gas down.
Well, they do. They are trying to do those things,
yeah,
but of course, don't forget Hamas thought this through before they started.
Exactly. Yeah.
They knew that's what would happen.
So Hamas knew that most of their civilians were going to be at risk, and tens of thousands of the civilians were going to die in this.
Well, that's an issue.
And the civilians didn't really get a say in that, did they?
No. Well, in one way you could say that, Tony, but in another way, Hamas were the elected leadership of the Palestinian people, and in fact,
funded by Netanyahu.
Oh, at one stage, yes, absolutely, because he was playing divide and rule with
So
Fatah.
what I'm saying is, it would be rather better for the tens of thousands of Palestinians that have died if October the 7th had never have happened. In a way, it was the kind of provocation the Israelis wanted.
Well, you could argue that, and I think obviously there's questions about how it happened, even on the Israeli side, because of course there were stock movements in Tel Aviv the day before, just like before 9/11. That meant that somebody knew what was going on, and of course there used to be 3 battalions. The place is surrounded by the Israeli army, and they were all withdrawn to the West Bank 48 hours previously, and it took them hours to get to start doing anything because they knew it was going to happen. They let it happen. And then they presumed that they'd be able to go into Gaza and just deal with Hamas. But of course, it didn't work out like that.
I'd just like to ask you about Turkey again. I mean, I know you don't want to get involved in the politics of this, but it's a NATO country, and yet it's worried about supporting Israel. Most of the NATO countries do support Israel. It's a bit of an anomaly.
By the way, what's NATO? Can you explain?
North Atlantic Treaty Organisation.
Okay. So where is it?
Well,
who funds it? Is it
it's the Americans. It's the Americans' alliance.
Oh, it's America then.
Yeah,
really. It's not.
Well, yes. Everybody else is just junior. They decide,
okay,
of course,
so
and Turkey's part of it.
Turkey is part of it as well.
Turkey allows the Americans
and Greece, of course. Greece is also part of it.
Turkey allows the Americans to keep nuclear weapons, Interlic, for example, doesn't it? I'm sure you know these things. But I'm curious as to how Turkey sits with the West, really, because it seems to me that really it's with the East.
Yeah. Well,
it's a difficult job for Erdogan to do that, surely.
Well, I don't know how to answer that one because Turkey is a NATO country, and well, Erdogan says we are with Palestine, but he's got to do what America says at the end of the day. I mean, with the Marmara ship, he was going to do this and that and the other. And he was going to nearly declare a war with Israel, but it just suddenly America was there, and it's just everything went well. Okay, well, we'll send the people back to Turkey, and just let's give you some money for the people who died. Like we'll give you $20 million, so just give like $2 million each to the whom died there, and they would just give that as a gift. That's not
It's not admitting liability.
No liability. Yeah. So in Turkey, they said it was like they were going to give it in dollars, and the government decided to give them all in Turkish lira just because, I don't know, whatever cheaper. The reason. Yeah, well, cheaper, yeah. And also, if there's any case anywhere in the world, Turkey will pay for the money that would given to the person who's taking this to court.
So what do you think is the actual objective of Israel? Because a lot of people looking at them saying that this could lead to their own self-destruction.
I don't know what to say. I mean, Turkey wants to do something, but they can't.
Why not?
They just can't. America wouldn't allow them.
Is Turkey really that in the hands of America?
Of course it is. I mean, when we went on the Marmara, they attacked army base in Turkey, killed a lot of people at the same time. They used PKK to do the attack, and there was some soldiers who died.
So the Americans did that, did they?
Well, yeah.
Well, the Americans. What's happened with the PKK is that they have slipped into the US orbit.
That's right. They're controlled by them as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very complex. As you know, it's a hugely complex situation.
This is the Kurds.
This is the Kurds.
I wouldn't say Kurds. I mean, I'll just say PKK.
Yeah, they see themselves as representing the Kurds.
I don't think they are representing the Kurds.
That's what they say.
I have loads of Kurdish friends, and they're just, they're proper human.
Yeah, what's happened is that they've allowed themselves to be manipulated by outside forces.
That's right, yeah.
But then the Israelis, for example, have very strong relations with Iraqi Kurdistan.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's some Jews in Iraq.
Yeah, well, there always was historically.
That's right,
lots of Jews in Iraq anyway. But I mean, the point is that the strategy of the Israelis is if they're confronting somebody in the face, they get together with people who are behind them as a way of trying to stab them in the back. Yeah, and a lot of the conflict in the Middle East has been caused by Israel. It's not just the oppression of the Palestinians, it's the destruction of Lebanon, the destruction of Syria, you know, the military dictatorship in Egypt and Iraq, which of course was the Israelis were pushing for that all the way. They have been very, very, you know, it's not just what they're doing. The same was true of South Africa back in the day. They were oppressing the people inside South Africa, but they were devastating Angola and Mozambique by terroristic incursions. You know, they've wrecked the economy in both of those countries. Millions of people died.
What role does religion play in all this, do you think?
Religion, obviously, being a Muslim, Al-Aqsa is very important to us, the Muslim.
This is the mosque in Jerusalem.
We call it Quds. So yeah, it is very important to us. And obviously they trying to knock it down. They want to build their temple there. They keep digging underneath, aren't they? So
they've got a cabinet room underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or Al-Quds, whatever you call it.
Al-Aqsa.
And they actually have meetings in there to show that it belongs to them. So they've got a meeting room which they.
You're talking about the Israelis here.
The Israelis, yeah. And they have meetings in there just to show that they're in charge.
They are in charge. Well, I mean, they think that God created us for them, so we can serve them all. You know, all the nations in the world.
Well, I wonder if they really do. Think
they do,
that.
yeah.
Do they really think that, or is this something that they've managed to persuade themselves? I've got a T-shirt with the flying saucer on it, and it says "I want to believe." All right, which sometimes attracts the wrong sort of people to talk to me about flying saucers. But the point of it is some people just believe what they want to believe because it's convenient, and in fact they're in a group of people who all believe the same thing, and it doesn't matter if it's true or not. That's what binds them together.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they really do believe in that. It's
a bit of a doomsday cult, is the reality.
Well, they've got nukes.
Yes, they have. And of course, Martin von Creveld, who was a Israeli military intellectual, if you can manage such a thing, he wrote a history of war, which I've read, and he said at one stage, we've got nuclear weapons, and of course, what the Europeans have got to understand is that we can bomb Rome, Paris, London. So don't try and tell us. That's the attitude.
Yeah.
Well, this Wednesday, the extremist Israeli settlers again stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque with support from the security forces. Yeah. Middle East Eye reports it as far-right Israelis attacked journalists and Palestinians at the flag march at Al-Aqsa. So this is going to happen eventually, isn't it? The Israelis are going to demolish this mosque. The Israelis are going to.
I really doubt it that will happen. I really don't think so.
You hope it doesn't happen, but surely...
Well, I hope.
I mean, this is a religious provocation. This is the sort of thing which is going to actually play into the Israeli... In a way, similar to October the 7th, the Israelis have set these various... It seems to me, anyway, they've set these various traps. So the idea is, here's a provocation, what are you going to do about it? And of course, people just will naturally react to that, especially when it's something so close to their heart. But the Israelis know that this is going to be the reaction. They hope for that because they're trying to fuel the conflict.
Well, I hope it doesn't happen, but if it does happen, something like that, and at the moment I think government they're not saying anything, are they? Most of Muslim, it's all surrounded by Muslim countries. Most of them are puppets. And so when it comes to something like that happens, I think the people of those countries, they're going to all walk over to Al-Aqsa. Yeah, and there will be a big conflict. So then even America won't be able to help. So people's power, I'll say, will kick in.
It's not just people power. If you saw the Iranian missile attacks recently, they were unable to stop those. They were simply making a point. Now, one of the things they did is they flew the missiles over the Knesset, and also over Al-Aqsa, so that people could see. If you touch Al-Aqsa, we will go to war with you.
This is it. Yeah.
And this war is already bigger than just Palestine, isn't it? It's already bigger than that. And of course it's linking up with the war in Ukraine and the continuing conflicts over Kurdistan and all the rest of it. And of course these people who are driving all of this in the West and the Israelis are not necessarily entirely rational. So they may do something stupid, but that's the good news in a way, because they haven't got a strategy.
Well,
they haven't got one.
The Americans are very much involved in all of this, particularly the Christian Zionists. I think really should have, inverted commas, swivel-eyed in the middle of the Christian swivel-eyed Zionists, because there is this bizarre idea that by backing genocide, that this is doing God's will somehow. And Nikki Haley, she's the US ambassador to the United Nations, Martin, this week, was at the Wailing Wall, saying that her visit to the wall was a blessing and that God has obviously blessed Israel. Now, she's actually part of this enormously powerful bunch of people that are intent on doing exactly what Shakir is saying. I hope they don't.
Yeah, well, what she did this week is she went to sign a bomb that was going to be fired into Gaza, saying something like "kill them all" or "finish the job" or something like this. You know, it's.
Yes. I mean,
what sort of person does something like that?
Not human.
Well, they are, sadly.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they're human.
Well, you know what I call them? Simple accelerationists. They're trying to accelerate the end of the world because they know that a war that was to start in that way would almost certainly immediately drag in the Americans. The Russians are already there. The Chinese, potentially after a period of time, would also be drawn in. And so we've got a horrific powder keg that's developed. And in order to just keep that powder keg going, the Israelis this week did a whole bunch of airstrikes on a UN-run school, killing at least 50 Palestinians. So let's have a listen to the Al Jazeera report this week from Wednesday about that.
It was 1:30 a.m. in the morning when the Israeli forces targeted this classroom in a Sardi school in Sayrat refugee camp. The Israeli forces targeted this school with at least 3 airstrikes.
Where could we go? There is no refuge for us. The schools targeted before and now again, but we have nowhere to go. They said shelters are safe, so we came here, but it turned out to be unsafe.
The smell is indescribable, where, as you see, the blood of the people who were killed is everywhere, on the floor, on their mattresses, on their pillows, their clothes. At least 5 children were killed among those. Despite the fact that this school has been targeted with at least 3 airstrikes last night, here on the other side are still Palestinian families still sheltering in the school because they believe that there is nowhere safe in Gaza.
Yes, we're still here. We're staying. Where else can we go? Everywhere is targeted, so we're not leaving. Everywhere else but the school. This is a UN building. It's not supposed to be targeted.
Even schools are not safe for Palestinians. This school, these classrooms, were targeted with at least 3 airstrikes last night. It was 1:30 a.m. when the Israeli army targeted those classrooms with at least 3 airstrikes. Children, women, and all of the people displaced here were telling me how horrifying the scenes were.
Can they find any solution? At least end the war to spare all this blood. They've butchered our hearts. These are our children. They've stripped them away from us. They are killing us.
So that's Al Jazeera reporting on this attack, Martin, again this week. Schools and hospitals seem to be the target of choice.
Well, that's because it is actually, it is a I mean, we just call it war crime if you don't want to call it genocide, but it's quite...
Well, we're not allowed to say genocide.
Well,
we certainly are here.
It doesn't really matter what we call it. It's the deliberate targeting of civilians because they want to kill them. It's quite straightforward.
That's right, yeah.
And of course, in actual fact, as I stated earlier, in terms of tackling Hamas, they haven't, they've killed hardly any fighters.
Oh, yeah.
The fighters are underground.
That's right.
They just come up, have a crack at them and go back under the ground. And of course, their families are being massacred. So that's making them madder than ever. Yeah, and there's still possibility of a ceasefire. Hamas have said, we want a permanent ceasefire. You'll have to withdraw from Gaza, and then you will talk to you. And then we need to settle this.
Hamas knows how good they are online.
Yeah, also the political leadership is capable of negotiation, so the rubbish is,
Sorry, carry on, Chicken.
Well, they bombing civilians and killing us. Oh, oops, sorry, that was a glitch as well, don't they?
I know this latest attack, they said, we did consider this many times and we called off the attack because we thought it was too dangerous. So this is a narrative which is just trotted out. We don't hear any kind of counter-narrative from the other side very much, because the reports are always phrased, this is the Hamas-run statistics or Hamas-run government. And so we're getting a very, shall we say, well-sculpted narrative and points of view from the Israeli side, and very little from the other. Although actually yesterday, I noticed this is Thursday, the day after this attack, we had someone from the UN talking about it, and the Israelis, there's no one available. Anyway, this war is going very bad from a hearts and minds point of view. From the Israelis, rather like the British in Afghanistan, very bad from a hearts and minds point of view. Are there going to be any consequences, Martin? So we've got a general election here. The Labour Party, it'd be interesting, we're going to hear in a minute now what Keir Starmer's got to say about sending arms to the Israelis.
Well, I think what's important for people like yourself and myself, and you, Tony, is that we must make this a major issue in the election campaign. So in Bristol Central, for example, the Greens have been absolutely clear, we want a ceasefire. And that's what the world is calling for. I'm actually saying we want a ceasefire.
People in Bristol, Martin, people want housing in Bristol.
Yes, they do. But on the other hand, there's also fundamental principles. We're going to hear about D-Day later on and all the rest of it. And of course, the blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by the Americans has ruined the West European economy, destroyed it. So if we're going to talk about the economy and cost of living, it comes back to the war anyway.
Price fixing as well, and green taxes that have been...
all right, but I mean, more important is blowing up a pipeline, Tony. That's pretty consequential.
What is the most amazing thing about that, I think, is the lack of any kind of complaint from Germany.
That's right.
Anyway, let's have a listen to the Labour leader who's about to become our Prime Minister. I'm shocked. No, I'm afraid to say, I don't know. I'd quite like to see George Galloway win. It's not so likely. But anyway, let's listen to hear what Keir Starmer's got to say about arms to Israel. He was asked a very good question. I think it was on Monday or Tuesday morning this week. He gave a press conference about that, and they still haven't released an actual manifesto, which is utterly bizarre. I mean, parties have manifestos ready at all times. Why can't they just publish it? Well, they're waiting to see what the other parties say, and we've got to have some sort of difference between now. Maybe if they were just to, Labour and Conservative were both to release their manifestos at the beginning of the election campaign, it would be very embarrassing because they both be the same. So let's have a listen to Keir Starmer now talking about arms to Israel. And this question, by the way, in the live BBC feed on BBC News Channel, as soon as the question was asked, there was a tiny bit of Keir Starmer's answer, and then they cut away. To a scene of I think it was a motor neurone disease memorial, with one reporter who couldn't hear what was being said, and they were focusing backwards and forwards. They were panning backwards and forwards, trying to find something to look at. And as soon as you sort of thought, they've found something now, then they'd pan again. And so I think it was some sort of media studies student straight out of college who they'd sent on their own to this thing. And anyway, by the time they'd finished realising that we can't really cover this at all, the question, of course, the answer by Keir Starmer finished, so they cut back to the conference. So this is the disgusting thing that they call the BBC, insulting everyone's intelligence by not allowing us to hear what you're about to hear now.
I know full well that national security, defence of our country is the number one issue. That is why I voted to renew the deterrent, and that's why I've been absolutely clear on this. I lead from the front. I've always led from the front, and this is an issue I feel very, very strongly about. Thank you very much, Carl. Serena from Sky.
Hi. You just said in your speech that you think playing a part on the global stage is important. You want to be a leader on the world stage. So on that issue, today 100 creatives have signed a letter urging you that if you get into government, they would like to see you halt UK arms sales to Israel, and they say this would end UK's complicity in war crimes in Gaza. Now, they said it would be a symbolic a symbolic move in line with your vision on change. Now, you said you want to see a summary of the UK's legal position around this. So my question is, do you believe in a moral case for stopping arms sales, given your concerns that you've said around the horrifying scenes in Gaza?
Well, the scenes in Gaza are horrifying, particularly in relation to Rafah. And that's why the number one priority is to ensure we get a ceasefire. We've been saying that for months now. And that means a ceasefire straight away, a cessation of the hostilities. Far too many people have lost their lives. Aid is desperately needed in the region. And, of course, there are still hostages who are held and have been held for a very, very long time. So humanitarian aid needs to get in. There needs to be that ceasefire. And there needs to be the beginning of a political process that leads to a two-stage solution. With Palestinian recognition as a state as part of that process, alongside a safe and secure Israel. So that's what needs to happen. That's where we want to work with allies. And that is important to me. But throughout this conflict, I've been in contact with our allies to make sure that if we are privileged to come in to serve our country, we're in a position to pick those discussions up and work with our allies towards that ceasefire. On the question of the arms sales, it is for the government, obviously, to review the licences. They do it one by one. They have got legal advice. We've been pressing them to disclose that legal advice. And I still press them to disclose that legal advice. Obviously, if we're privileged to come into power, we'll be able to see that advice or commission our own. But look, I will just add this, that the Rafah offensive should not go ahead. And that I think our government should follow the US lead on this in relation to arms sales and review the licences to see whether any of them would be or are being used in Rafah offensive. Thank you.
Right, so that's Keir Starmer speaking earlier this week. Shakir, he's saying that actually they've not been allowed to see the legal advice, and when the Labour Party takes over running the country, the Team B takes over, they will commission their own legal advice. But he's not saying that they're going to stop arms supplies.
Well, as I said, I don't want to get into politics, and so...
Well, what's interesting to me listening to that is how he's wriggling around and trying to finesse his position. Yeah. And that's because we've put him under enormous pressure. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Lots of people are really, really angry when he came out the first few weeks saying that they've got a right to starve the Palestinians. Which he did. He said it, and then he went back on it. Mm. I think it suddenly crossed his mind because of all the fuss and arguments and rows that's been, that this isn't actually in his best interests. He needs to be somewhere. You know, he shouldn't be lining up with the government to carry, in support of genocide. So I think these things are straws in the wind. Of course, when he comes to power, the Americans are going to do what the Americans are going to do, and he'll just say, "Well, what do you want me to do?" Because that's what will happen.
Well, they do what they want to do, and Rafah is being controlled by Israelis, so the trucks are waiting to get in. The aid itself,
it's all ready to go, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just thousands of trucks are there to go in, and people are starving in Gaza.
Well, this is going to be interesting as we come into the election campaign, because this could, before the end of the year, we could see maybe 1 million people die of starvation here while the world watches.
Yeah.
And I think if Keir Starmer thinks he's just going to be doing a bit more on social housing and getting the economy right, they're living in a dream world. Because, of course, the wars are, in fact, what the problems with the economy is about. Yeah? the sanctions on Russia and the knocking out the Nord Stream pipelines actually trashed the European economy. And we're not allowed to talk about it. It's like, that's not economics, that's warfare, we don't want to talk. No. And they're living in a world where... They're living in a past world which was more secure than the one we're going into. We're now going into probably the most turbulent period since World War II. And old ways of doing things ain't going to cut the mustard.
That's largely because someone seems to have torn up the international law rulebook. Look, we're going to finish, Shakir. Thanks very much for spending so much time here, for your time, by looking at prospects for peace. One of the things that I complain about quite regularly, actually, and maybe Martin might have something to say about this, is the inaction of the Chinese. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. I would have hoped, at the very least, Martin, to hear the Chinese calling for some sort of international peacekeeping force to get in between these civilians and the Israelis. Well, in fact, to occupy Gaza, possibly even to be involved in the pushing back of the Israelis to their legal borders.
That's right.
Well, I mean, the Chinese, in fact, have taken a fairly strong line. They've said that this is intolerable, and they've also said Hamas...
They've done nothing about it, really, at the UN Security Council. These are the sorts
No, they've voted with everybody else.
They have voted away, but they haven't taken initiatives which are basically needed. This is the whole purpose of the UN, surely. In this sort of situation, where there's an ongoing massacre of civilians, the UN needs to be in there with their, whatever, blue helmets, whatever they are.
That's fantasy.
And it's not fantasy, no. These are the sorts... It may not happen.
There were blue helmets in Bosnia and over there. They couldn't stop anything.
It may not happen, but the point is that someone should be calling for it. The Russians, of course, will be accused of just doing this in order to annoy the Americans, probably. But China could, and it's just not doing anything.
Can I just say what China has done? They've said that Hamas is entitled to armed resistance. There's no politicians in Britain saying that. Yeah? No. They don't dare.
No.
Yeah.
But they're not doing anything about it.
No, they are doing something about it. They've got Hamas and Fatah went to Peking, or to Beijing, because what the Chinese and the Russians are doing is trying to get the Palestinians into one team together, because if we're all going to war for them, we need them all on the one team.
It's taking too long, isn't it? Too many civilians.
Yeah, but
you'll understand
if you're the Russian or Chinese general staff, or even the Iranian or Syrian general staff, it's a very big, complicated thing, because this is going to be a big old war.
Anyway,
China, and it isn't just about Palestine.
China has put forward this latest initiative last week, so I'll just play this and then you can have your final say about it, whether you think there are prospects for peace. So we'll have a listen to this first.
Meeting every 2 years, this is the 10th summit of the China-Arab Cooperation Forum. And it comes as Beijing seems keen to demonstrate its closeness to Arab states and support for the Palestinian cause.
China firmly supports the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that enjoys full sovereignty based on the 1967 borders, and with East Jerusalem as its capital. It supports Palestine's full membership in the UN and supports a more broad-based, authoritative and effective international peace conference.
As well as calling for an immediate ceasefire, China has pledged millions of dollars in emergency humanitarian assistance to Gaza.
I call on the international community to fulfill their moral and legal responsibility to stop this brutal Israeli war and to immediately provide for long-term humanitarian assistance and to end the Israeli siege.
China has been expanding its influence in the Middle East as that of its US rivals has waned during the war. Last year, Beijing brokered a landmark reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
China is willing to work with Arab countries to strengthen communication and coordination on multilateral platforms like the United Nations, jointly advocating for world multilateralism of equality and order, opposing hegemonism and power politics.
China has also promised further cooperation with Arab states on oil and gas production and large-scale infrastructure investment. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera.
Yeah, so China is doing something, but is it enough? What do you make of the prospects for peace over there?
Well, China might be a good choice, to be honest. America's not going to do anything. We know it. Israel killed the two-state solution, I think, personally. There won't be two-state solution no more, because what Israel's saying and not doing it. Again, it's just like lying. So Hamas is not having that anymore. Let's see what China can do. I mean, world leaders actually can stop this war, stop America.
How?
Well, there must be a solution somewhere. Giving them their state back, Gaza itself, and...
Well, I think the Chinese are positioning themselves to be mediators insofar as they can. Yeah. They don't really... They've got their own problems. Yeah. They don't really want to get involved in other people's fights.
They're chicken.
That's a pretty foolish thing to say.
No, it isn't. No, I don't think so. I think that if you're a world power, you need to have the courage of your convictions to at least suggest, say, like I said,
maybe we should start an arms struggle right here in Britain.
A peacekeeping force of the UN. We're not talking about an arms struggle in Britain, people picking up guns here, Martin. Right. What we're talking about is the Chinese pushing at the UN for some sort of peacekeeping force.
Well, no, the UN peacekeeping force can only go in if there's been a political solution. And if there's a political solution, it could well be that Hamas armed forces will control their territory, and the Israelis will control their territory.
Might the Chinese help force a political solution?
They're doing what they can, and of course, the way the Chinese got the Iranians and the Saudis together was say, look, let's do some business.
Maybe it's just that the Chinese don't have much experience.
Let's all get rich.
Maybe it's China doesn't have much experience. They have a lot of experience at building massive railways and viaducts, and but not necessarily in international diplomacy. They don't have much courage. I think the Russians, Russians probably have more experience.
Well, the Russians...
No, I reckon Turkey have more experience on that one. They can go in the middle between Israel and Hamas and control the area.
Right.
And so
in other words, these powers which are not directly involved, like China, can play a very constructive role because they haven't got any history.
So you're saying
nobody's particularly hostile to
Bosnia
them.
is a good example, Martin. You're saying the UN were useless there?
Well, they were useless, yeah.
They're useless because of the US veto.
Yeah.
I mean, what the UN wants to do is clear, but the US and the British just say, no, we're not doing that. And that's where we're at with that. But of course, they're losing huge amounts of credibility all over the world.
They're still finding human remains since what? When was the war? 1992 started, wasn't it?
Whereabouts?
Bosnia.
Oh yeah, I mean that was all of that at the time. I thought it was all to do with internal conflicts, but with hindsight, you can see that outside forces were fomenting the trouble, and that this is the way the West operates. They create chaos so that they can then control the follow-on.
Yugoslavia just completed.
That's right, and of course the EU had already set up an agreement to settle the war. And the Americans and the Americans more than the British went to Izetbegovic, who was the leader of the Bosnians, and said, "No, fight on, and we'll come in and support, and you'll get a better deal." So they did, with all the consequences. Yeah. And when the Americans finally come in, they got the same deal they could have had in the first place from the EU. But the important thing is, it's an American deal, not an EU deal. So the EU were told, even in your own backyard, we decide what goes on.
So in a way, we need to stop America.
Well, it's becoming obvious to the whole world.
The whole world is
now waking up to the fact that these people are the problem.
That's right, they're the problems. Why can't they just get on with their own country, just solve the America and leave us alone so we can get on with... where are they? We're just thousands of miles away from Gaza, and they're getting intervened.
Well, there's the money, a lot of it seems to me.
Oh, I see, right.
The military-industrial complex, people are making money out of it.
So arms deals...
and so the bombs that killed the UN school in Gaza, that killed the kids in the UN school Wednesday in Gaza, were US bombs. It's quite clearly the American,
and they're gifting them as well. They're not even paying for them.
Yes,
it's the American taxpayer who are paying for this massacre.
Why? I wonder why.
Because we could argue about this, but the Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby in the US, is the most powerful lobby of all. You cannot get elected in the US unless you've got money from this lobby. And this money is all actually taxpayers' money.
So it explains it all, doesn't it?
Yeah, so in other words, they get the money from the US taxes, they feed it to Israel then feeds it back into the US, which then buys the politicians to keep the whole thing going.
So where is the Americans in this?
Well, the ordinary Americans are not in it. They are, as we can see, what's very interesting, public opinion in the US is very much in favour of a ceasefire, and we've seen all these students doing a fantastic job going out and saying we're not standing for this.
And in Britain, by the way.
Oh, yes, and in Britain.
The leaders are ignoring them. So, anyway, we have a bit of it seems to me, a bunch of leaders in the West who just do what they want. They're not interested. They keep talking about democracy and D-Day and things like this. But Actually, it's democracy. It's not democracy.
Yeah, I like that.
So, anyway, we're joined in a studio. Just before you go, Shakir, I'd be interested to get Stella's view on this. I know Stella Perrett, who's coming, just arrived in the studio, shaking hands with Shakir now. Stella, you're part of a group which is campaigning in the general election. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's nice to meet you, and nice to be back here again. Haven't been here for ages. I've been involved with getting women's rights candidates onto the ballot round the country, and also here in Bristol. And right up to the last minute, when nominations closed this afternoon at 4 o'clock, we were still waiting with bated breath to see if our candidates had got through.
Give us an idea of what is it a specific party? Are these independent candidates?
Yeah, a brand new party was set up just before the local elections. In fact, it was only registered by the Electoral Commission in sort of April, and it's called Party of Women. We managed to get a handful of candidates in the local elections, more in the northern seats, actually, which is the first time any completely pro-women's party has raised candidates for elections in this country. And we see it very much, it's obviously a protest party, it's obviously a one issue almost, except that we feel that women's rights is in every area of life. Education and child safeguarding and all the rest of it. So we hope that the party will be a legitimate platform for women to be able to speak these views in public.
Yeah, good. And I'm hoping that you and Martin are now going to have an enormous argument about what this election is all about. Because Martin wants it to be all about Gaza.
No, I'm sure he doesn't want it to be all about Gaza. I mean, we are in Britain.
Well, it's what you just said, isn't it? You want to make this...
yes, there are a few other issues.
You want to make it the pivotal point of the election. So what...
I would like to draw your attention to Ashley Ward, which is where we're sitting, actually. And Ashley Ward, the Green Party in Ashley Ward, 2 weeks before the general election, ditched their sitting councillor, a middle-aged lady called Jude English, because she had stuck up for women's rights. So the lady who's standing in Bristol Central, Carla, who's their leader, she sent to Carla a thing called the Green Women's Declaration, which is within the Greens, which is gender critical women within the Greens. They've got their own declaration. She sent it off to her, and at the top of the tweet, she put, what does it take to be a leader, Carla? And does it mean representing all of Bristol's citizens? Because she's a lesbian, and so obviously they feel marginalised, right? And,
sorry, who is the
lesbians and also women and men who are...
Who is, which of these two women is a lesbian in the Green Party?
The lady who's been ditched, who's been sacked by the Greens. Jude English, right. And so she declared this on Twitter and sent it off to her leader. Within 48 hours she was dropped, bearing in mind she was a sitting councillor, so she was automatically the candidate. Within 24 hours she was dropped, and of course then it was so close to the local election, where are they going to get a replacement from? So they put in her place a gentleman who we all know, who's been party hopping around Bristol for about 30 years, Mr Malik, who's the chairman of Eastern Mosque. He's been in the Greens about 5 minutes prior to that. So there we have an example here in Bristol of how the Greens are actually dropping it, and this is oppression of their own female candidates. They've done it around the country, not just here. This is only one example. And what they do, they say, right, we're suspending you. We've had some anonymous complaint. We're going to suspend you, but we can't deal with it here locally. We have to send the complaint up to our national party, and that we know women who've been waiting nearly 2 years to have so-called complaints dealt with.
Okay, so let's just look, Shakir, before we say goodbye to you, this is an important issue for people right across the country, Gaza, but you can understand that some people will be thinking, forget that, we need to vote on our own politics, we need to sort our own country out first.
Well, maybe the world actually, if run by women, might be a better place to live. Don't you think?
Well, listen, no. I don't think it makes any difference. I don't think it makes it's a nice idea. I don't think it makes any difference. This is a sort of divide and rule thing, I don't think there's really... women and men are far more similar than different. And the differences, I think, there is a big attempt through, for example, in the trans agenda, to get people against each other, to actually get people fighting each other over... trivia. A lot of this stuff is trivia, and a lot of it is to do with bullying. They say it's bullying. Is it really bullying? Is it someone feeling very upset about nothing, or about something substantial? And these are the sorts of things that the police can look into. But you have an immense amount of discussion and comment about things that are not matters for the police.
Women got more rights than we have.
Have they? Is that right, Stan?
Oh, have they? What, really? In countries like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi?
I've always seen that case. How about Gaza?
Gaza even, yeah. And how many rights have they got?
You're internationalising the discussion now.
It's been brought in, hasn't it?
Well, yeah.
Anyway, we're going to hear now from somebody who I think most of listeners here, as well as us all in the studio, certainly find as an interesting ingredient in this general election. Probably one of the only really interesting people who's standing. That's George Galloway. So thanks ever so much for joining us, Shakir. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Can you just say, by the way, you mentioned a couple of websites where you get some news about what's going on in Palestine, because obviously the BBC, when something interesting happens, like Keir Starmer explains his policy on arms to Israel, the BBC just would rather come up with a blank screen than actually transmit it.
They're on
it's Quds.
Quds News Network. They're on.
And what is Quds? What does the word mean?
Well, it's Al-Aqsa and Quds.
It's the Arabic name for Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah, Al-Quds and.
Okay, let me just read it out. QUDS, Quds News Network. That sounds like an interesting, useful source.
It is. I mean, you can follow it. They're on what's this one called? Telegram.
Oh dear.
Oh, yeah.
Telegram.
Yeah,
That evil Russian system. No. At least it's not as censored as the BBC. Anyway,
you can get loads of latest bombings from Gaza, latest news.
I hope you didn't get any of these. I mean, one of the things that was really actually annoyed me, and I get frustrated when I see these videos from Gaza, from both the Israeli side and from the Hamas side, where they've got this exciting music in the background. You think, no. It's inappropriate, totally inappropriate. Exactly. But apparently this is how these things get sold to the youngsters, and they're encouraged to back one side or the other. But anyway, look, so we're going to start actually on your topic, Stella. That is with the Greens, because they have been talking about anti-Semitism. Actually, their accusations of anti-Semitism of people in the Green Party. So let's have a little listen to the discussion at Laura Koonsberg with one of the leaders of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsey, on Sunday, where she's making all sorts of making accusations about the attitude towards the Gaza conflict and certain Green candidates. So let's have a listen to that now.
There have been a number of allegations of anti-Semitic comments made by some of your people who are standing to be MPs, including one who recently promoted a conspiracy theory that Israel had conspired to allow the October the 7th attacks to take place, when more than 1,000 people were killed and many taken hostages. Should someone who stated that be allowed to stand as an MP?
No, they shouldn't, and the Green Party takes any suggestions of anti-Semitism or indeed any form of racism very seriously, and any suggestions that have been made of inappropriate comments in recent weeks are being investigated by the relevant people in the party. That has to be separate from the party leadership, is a clear message of good governance.
So will you be barring candidates then? I mean, there are at least 3 examples that have been reported on about people who want to be Green MPs, who want to be standing, saying things on social media or liking posts on social media. One of them said Israel must be eliminated, for example. Will those people be off your list?
So in the last couple of weeks there were 3 candidates who had been selected who are no longer going forward. I understand there's a small number more who are still being looked at, and for the first time the Green Party is planning to stand candidates right across England and Wales. That's 570 seats. You've referred to a small number of examples here, but in terms of those seats where we've got a fantastic chance of winning at this election, seats like Bristol Central, Waveney Valley, North Herefordshire, Brighton Pavilion, we plan to get at least 4 Green MPs elected to push the new government to be bolder, because rather than Labour's timid promises on public services and climate, if this new government is going to take the action that's needed, we need Green voices in Parliament to push them to take the real hope and real change that this country needs.
OK, well, of course, we don't know who that new government will be, but interesting that you're focusing your sights on Labour. But, Adrian, thank you very much indeed for coming in. It's always great to have one of the Greens with us in the studio. And there will, in time, be a full list of candidates everywhere on the BBC website.
So you can't say Israel must be eliminated, but you can say Hamas must be eliminated.
Yes. What you've got to understand is the Overton window of what you can say. The concept of the Overton window is what is respectable opinion allowed to say. Now, if you think about it, the idea that the Israelis did or didn't have foreknowledge of what happened on October the 7th is actually a factual matter. It's not something which you can have an opinion about unless you know the facts of it. In Israel itself, there's lots of discussion about why the army didn't react quickly and what was going on.
Yeah, and whether the Egyptians actually gave them a warning.
Yes, and all of this stuff. But of course, in the British political system, if you want to be, this is Laura Kuenssberg acting like the Grand Inquisitor there. So these are the opinions that you're not allowed to have, as a Green or as anything. And of course the Greens are buying into that because they don't want to be unrespectable. Now, in actual fact, the idea that the Israelis had something to do with the October the 7th attack is a perfectly reasonable idea, but you can't talk about it.
So it's almost like the Green Party are chicken too.
Well, the Green Party are trying to become a mainstream political party,
anyway,
so they can get drawn into this game, don't they?
They're talking there about Bristol Central. This is going to be quite an important fight, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which one of your candidates is standing? Can you say something about that?
And here we are with the politics of the Middle East coming right here into the middle of Bristol with this election, clearly, because the Greens are having to answer these questions about their candidates, including Mr Malik, who was elected to the council. The same accusations were made against him, that he said these things about October the 7th. He hasn't stood for Parliament yet, but he may do in the future. So they seem to be having a purge on two fronts, don't they? They're purging candidates who say things they don't like about the Middle East situation, and they're purging their GC candidates as well.
What do you make of the two main parties and the general election? In a wider sense, is there any point in standing in this system?
No, well, personally, I'm as old as you are, Tony, maybe even older, and we all know that this is the last country in Europe that doesn't have any form of PR, so it's always going to be uniparty. It's just going to be the Tories and Labour exchanging seats every 4 years. Always has been, always will be. The only reason the Tories have been in power for so long is because the Liberal Democrats propped them up in a coalition government. I mean, come on, be fair, So that's why we are where we are. It's always going to be the same unless we have some kind of PR.
So what's your platform you're standing on?
Well, we're standing on just women's rights and child safeguarding. These are things that women have been lost their jobs, lost their positions, been platformed over. Me myself. I was cancelled by the Morning Star back in 2020 for making a comment in a cartoon about this very issue. So, we're very well aware of this. We felt that having a political party is possibly the only way, because we now have a legal platform. So now, when we hold a rally on College Green and we get mobbed, by Infantifa and all their pals that they muster.
Sorry, who is this Infantifa?
Infantifa. Well, the boys and girls who are mimicking Antifa in America. We call them Infantifa over here. Okay, so they bring their sort of heavies to opposers and try and shout us down, and the police do their best to keep both sides apart, and but this time they will have a hard job, because we're now a registered political party with the Electoral Commission, and if they try to suppress our voices in the general election campaign, it's going to be a lot harder for them to get away with it.
Now, we can't quite say exactly who will be standing, because nominations literally have only just closed for this general election, but obviously the main parties in Bristol are going to be the Greens, who now have the largest. We've got the Labour and the Conservative and the Liberal Democrats, aren't they?
Yeah, and I was involved with the Liberals for many, many years, been a candidate for them and an approved parliamentary candidate back in the day. So yeah, I know the history of Bristol.
So why aren't you still
a
Lib Dem? What do they think on the issues that you're standing for?
We don't see that you can put a cigarette paper between the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and we don't think you can put a cigarette paper between Labour and Conservative. The only way to smash first past the post, if nobody is willing to campaign for PR in any way, shape or form, the only way is to try and bust it by voting for smaller parties and independents.
Martin, you want to bust PR, don't you? And I think I quite agree. Yeah, you want to bust the system and you want PR.
Yeah, well, I think...
So how do you do it? Stella's just suggested smaller parties are the way.
Well, I think in Northern Ireland, for example, you've got elections under all sorts of systems. In this Westminster election that's coming up, that will be a first-past-the-post election. But, of course, elections to the Assembly, after a great deal of struggle and argument, had to be PR, because it was the only way to kind of get people on both sides to talk to each other. Now, what happens in that situation is that the activists on both sides, loyalist and nationalist, they know that in a first-past-the-post election, you've got to be tactical voters. Yeah, and that could involve voting for us in a situation where you've got a massive Labour majority, for example. You can safely vote for an alternative party because they're not going to lose.
To be a spoiler party.
To be a spoiler party, and I think a lot Labour are going to lose a lot of votes in their heartland areas because of that.
Well, I'm going to put something to you. I cannot understand how any former Liberal voters, former Green voters, disaffected Tory voters, who is going to vote Labour now they've said that they're happy to have nuclear weapons back on British soil?
Well, some people will because that's not the main issue for them. Yeah, I mean, and they're there anyway. It's not as if we're going to get them. We've got them. They're just not going to get rid of them. But I think what from my point of view, Stella, what makes me really angry about that is we're running the risk of having a nuclear war with Russia. David Cameron said that we're going to allow the SAS to fire Storm Shadow missiles into Russia at military targets in Russia, and the Russians said if you do that, we're going to fire back at you. And if you then fire back at us, we're on the nuclear escalation ladder.
Yeah. And does anybody think that it doesn't mean American bases with their weapons back on British soil? Of course, it will come back. And this is where we were decades ago.
I know, but it's actually more dangerous now. Starmer is clearly not... he's going to be well out of his depth when he arrives there. And, of course, Sunak is even further out of his depth.
Martin, when I was a child, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was too young to remember that, but I've been through numerous of these scares. I actually feel more frightened about the possibility of World War III now than I ever have my life.
Well, there's a very good reason for that, because it's much more likely now than it's ever been. And it's largely due to the belligerent attitude. Back in the day, Kennedy was sufficiently smart to realise that nuclear war isn't an option. And, of course, if you've watched the film 13 Days in May, which is based on the tapes of him arguing with his generals are clearly mad. They're definitely prepared to have a nuclear war. And here's the elected leader is saying, no, we're not doing that. Yeah?
Well, even during the Cold War, we had policy of détente going on in Germany and all that. And so... don't you think our politicians were more sensible back in those days?
Well, they were, because we were more... What happened was, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West got into the lazy idea that we didn't have to worry about nuclear war anymore, because, there wasn't going to be one and we'd won anyway. And, of course, in actual fact... That's not the case. History didn't end. A modern democratic state in Russia has turned out to be a threat to Western imperial power, and they instead of dealing with them in a responsible fashion, like we dealt with the communists when they were in charge, deals were done, nuclear weapons were reduced. But what's happened is that since Russia has become democratic, all those deals that we did with the communists, we've ripped them up. What's the sense of that? And, of course, people have just watched this happen. And, of course, the Greens have got more and more obsessed with climate change. And you feel like saying, look, there's a nuclear war issue here.
Why are all our gas bills so high? Because of the Ukraine-Russia war.
Yes, that's right. So, in other words, when they say, it's the economy's stupid. So when the Americans blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, was saying that was a death knell for the German economy, which is a death knell for the European economy. So that was the Americans doing that to us.
I'm sure we all feel that here we are, little people trying to get on with our lives, and all this is going on up there somewhere.
Yeah.
There could be a nuclear war. We have no control over it whatsoever. We rely on the people we elect to try and do something sensible. And it's all failing. We can see it's all failing.
Last week I spoke to Steve Baker's parliamentary office on the phone, and I wouldn't normally do this, but I got such a bizarre reaction from the lady that spoke. I did have a bit of sound because I was a little bit suspicious about what they were going to do and what they were going to say. This is where the UK Space Command is based, in High Wycombe. Actually, it turns out it's not Steve Baker's constituency. UK Space Command is somewhere else, but the Space Command is designed to look for Russian nuclear weapons if they're heading towards us. So I phoned them up, and then his researcher then phoned me back. I wanted to get either him or his neighbouring MP some sort of statement from them about the fact that so many of these, now 3 of these Russian early warning radars have been destroyed, not really by Ukraine, but by NATO. The Russians certainly don't consider it's Ukrainians destroying these nuclear ballistic missile early warning radars. In fact, anyone that was listening last week will have heard our report from Duncan Campbell talking about how serious this is becoming. He's the investigative journalist from the BBC from the 1980s who did the series Secret Society. And so here is Steve Baker's constituency researcher I was talking to about this, because I can't actually get any one of these MPs to respond. What do you think about us taking out these Russian early defence radars? And what does this mean for UK Space Command? Are they worried that some of these UK equivalents or other NATO equivalents are going to be taken out by the Russians if we take theirs out?
I rang you earlier, but unfortunately I couldn't get hold of you. Can you say, in your message, are you asking about RAF High Wycombe?
Yes. Well, I mean, I know that's where the UK's early warning defences, it's the headquarters for it. So I thought it'd be Steve who might have something to say about it.
No, because RAF High Wycombe isn't in High Wycombe. That's what I needed to tell you.
Oh, isn't it? Oh,
no. So we're not I mean, there are no MPs tomorrow, so you won't get MP statements anyway, because Parliament's dissolved tomorrow. So after tonight, there are no more MPs. Every MP that's currently restanding becomes a parliamentary candidate.
Right.
But if you want to speak to Rob Butler's office, so basically, RAF High Wycombe is in an area called Knaphill. It's just over the constituency border, and it comes under the Aylesbury constituency, which today is still Rob Butler MP. I won't give the London number because the London offices are all shutting down. So 01296, if you've got a pen.
Hang on a sec. All right, hang on.
Who do you work for, sorry?
Well, we have an arts centre in here. We have a weekly radio show podcast. So what's this number? 012, I've half got it down here, 01296.
Yeah. Okay, 01296 428 972.
And that's for Rob. So what's happening with Steve then?
How do you mean?
He's standing in High Wycombe still, is he?
Yeah, he will be, yeah.
I mean, I think you should put this to him as an interview request, if you haven't done that already, because he's ex-RAF himself, and this is an RAF system, isn't it?
Unfortunately, you would probably need to speak to Rob about that, not to Steve. We can't really take MP interviews now, I'm afraid, because
so won't he just say the same as that?
I'm really sorry. I mean, I can just have to refer you to Rob. I have given your number to Steve, but I think I need to refer you to Rob. I'm really sorry.
All right, so he doesn't. Okay. No, you're saying he doesn't want to do it.
I'm really sorry, Mr. Gosling. I really can't tell you anymore. I'm a caseworker. I'm not here to do sound bites. I'm really sorry. Okay.
No, I'm not asking for sound bites. I'm saying, has Steve said no, he doesn't want to do it? At which point she put the phone down. So there's me trying to find out, get some of the local MPs to give a comment about the takeout of filing Dales potentially after we take out these Russian early warning radar systems. I mean, this is, I have to do, it's interesting. I mean, the reason I played that is because I just can't get a statement out of any of these MPs about what's happening, Stella. And I think in a way, I love the fact that people like you are involved with standing alternative candidates, because these MPs, they have all this responsibility, they have all this knowledge, and yet I'm asking a simple request about what I think is quite an important matter about a potential nuclear war and defending your country and whether your radars are going to be hit by the Russians or whether we've been hitting theirs. And that's the sort of response you get, basically nothing.
Well, I must say I feel quite sorry for that woman, because obviously she's in the position where her boss isn't there and she can't get hold of him, and they're going into
But she wouldn't even tell me if she'd actually asked Steve for an interview, which is why I phoned them. And of course I phoned the number that she gave me, Rob Butler, no answer, no reply, not even an answer phone to leave a message on. So, you know, this is me trying to do the job of finding out for the public what's going on with two MPs that clearly are quite close to the RAF and to the British defence system. And you get nothing.
Doesn't instill confidence, does it? No, that's right.
I think she had the letter out there, which is that once there are no more MPs, they're parliamentary candidates. So she presumably was employed by the MP's office.
That's tonight she was talking about. They are MPs today, and anyway, there'll be candidates tomorrow. You know, it's just the usual wriggle. Oh, we don't want to do that. Why should we? Maybe if it's the BBC and we get someone, you know, like Laura Koonsberg.
Well, I mean, you're doing a very good job of getting your foot in the door there, but you can understand part of her job is to stop you coming through that door.
No,
That's
part
what she's paid for.
Part of her job is to make sure that the MPs are serving their constituents. That's part of her job. Anyway, you know, I just thought it'd be interesting for people to hear little conversations like that go on. I mean, generally, the system seems pretty much, with the Union Party still, broken, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the position we're taking with Party of Women is that we do not vet our candidates or supporters on what part of the political spectrum they've come from. So we do not have arguments with our people. We are standing on a single platform, basically, which is the freedom to say certain things, which I don't even know if I'm allowed to say on your radio station, but I can read them out.
Yes, you can. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have. I mean,
unless we have to edit it out.
Our manifesto is literally four slogans long.
Go on, then.
Men can't be women. Women can't be men. Transitioning children is abuse. You know, and so these things are.
That's three.
Oh, yeah, what was the other one? I should know, shouldn't I? But those are the kind of things.
Men can't be women, women can't be men.
Yeah.
Transitioning
it's a bit
children
more, it's a bit more,
is abuse.
It's a bit
What's
more,
the fourth one?
It's a bit more specific than that. It's women can't have penises and men can't have vaginas. Yes.
Right.
Okay. So that's why it's difficult to say on public platforms. We get our candidates. We've already had a candidate who has been given an eviction notice, intimidated by her own landlord when she tried to get nominations to stand. That was up in Edinburgh. She's known these people for 12 years, thought they were her friends, asked for the signatures on the nomination paper, and the answer was, I'm evicting you and your business from my building. So that is before...
Well, that is the right of a landlord to do that,
That's
isn't
before... Well... If you think so, I mean, that is before somebody even gets to stand as an MP. That's not even getting through the process. This is the sort of thing we've had to face, and I'm because of the platform we stand on, it's harder for us to get candidates than probably a lot of other smaller parties. But I would recommend voting for smaller parties. I'm not voting for either of the two big parties.
So would I. And also, of course, it sends a message, doesn't it? But I mean, Martin, when the Nazis in Nazi Germany, in the Weimar Republic, and in the build-up to the Second World War, there were loads and loads of little parties, weren't there, in Nazi Germany, and it caused a sort of chaos. Maybe the similar thing is happening in Britain now, something similar, where the mainstream politics has just broken down. It's been infiltrated. It's been taken over by special interests like. I mean, I don't know if you saw that Stephen Hester thing again yesterday. This guy who's got a massive contract with the National Health Service to do patient records, and he's calling for Diane Abbott to be shot. He is now the biggest donor to the Conservative Party, and the Conservatives took another £5 million off of him just the day after these revelations of him with this racist and intimidating, actually threats to kill an MP.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's quite a lot. I mean, we've ranged over the territory.
Well, I'm talking about the general fact that, you know, you've got the Union Party, and the whole of politics is starting to fracture, isn't it?
Well, I think the thing is that what really messed up the PR campaign was the Liberal Democrats going into coalition with the Tories, which they'd never have done. It was disastrous policy for them. They had 50-something MPs, and they ended up with 8, or less than 8. And of course, they were promised that they would get a referendum on the alternative vote, which they should have said, we're not going to do that. We want, you know, they shouldn't have gone into coalition with them at all, because they didn't have a majority. So they've had to have a minority Tory government, which wouldn't have been able to do anything. See, if in a broken system, you've got to think very carefully about what your tactics are. So when Bobby Sands stood as an MP from his prison cell, all the other nationalist candidates dropped out because it was a first-past-the-post Westminster election to make sure he was the only nationalist on the ballot. And the same thing happened on the Unionist side, where Ken McGuinness, who was a major in the UDR, all the other candidates on their side dropped out. But nevertheless, when it comes to elections to the Assembly, you can vote for minor parties because it's not a wasted vote. The thing about having PR is no vote is wasted. Yeah.
I think the argument people always make about PR is that you end up with multi-party coalitions. Now, the advantage of that is that nobody gets to be top dog, but the disadvantage is nobody gets to be a rebel. So you have a party coming up that think they're the great rebels, they're reform at the moment, oh, we're the great rebels and we're going to smash this. They won't even get to the stage where they have enough. Even if they get 30% in the popular opinion poll, they're unlikely to get any seats. We've seen that with the Liberals in the past. Yep. We've seen that with, back in the days of the SDP Liberal Alliance, they were smashing it up to 30%. They didn't get any MPs.
So you sound to me like a single issue party, are you?
We are, ultimately, yes, but our candidates can also speak on all the subjects that people bring up, because when it comes to things like education and health service and
What about the price of food in the supermarket?
Well, yeah, all right, okay, this isn't Women's Hour, but, we are standing on, you wanted me to read out the fourth one. The fourth one was, there's no such thing as non-binary, by the way. So
what does that mean?
A lot of people don't think they're men or women, and so they call themselves non-binary. So we just say there's no such thing as non-binary. But these sound like fairly simple, basic slogans, but this is why our candidates have got a much more difficult time being public, going public, finding people to support them. And we want to try and...
But I mean, surely if people are going to vote for you, what they're thinking is your party, what's it called?
Party of Women.
The Party of Women. Going to bring down the price of food in the supermarkets?
No, they will vote for us as a protest vote, just like they might be voting for reform as a protest vote.
There's something going on, Martin, isn't it, where people are just voting against things. There's nothing really that they're voting for.
Well, that's one of the things about a first-past-the-post election. You've got to vote against what you don't want, rather than necessarily voting for what you do want. Although there's always going to be a legitimate place for protest parties, because you don't necessarily want to have a big vote. You just want this issue in the public domain.
I mean, it seems to me all of the parties, including these sort of new fringe parties like the Greens, for example, have such, can I call it toxic policies? Meat and dairy rationing is one of them, apparently. Now, I'm not sure they've even, like most of the other parties, have got round to issuing a formal manifesto, but this is the Green co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, speaking on Laura Koonsberg this week, and she was saying to him, well, hang on, you've got this policy which is about dairy and meat rationing. Do you think people are going to vote for that?
Your policy document also says the population of the UK is consuming more than its fair share. And you cite food and farming, as most people would agree, as big sources of harmful emissions. And your document then says the Green Party will use rationing to reduce the amounts of meat and dairy consumed in the UK. So how much less milk would you want people to drink? And should people watching at home put down their bacon sandwiches right now?
Well, we haven't yet produced our manifesto for the next 5 years, and when we put that out in the next...
But this is in your policy platform. It's available on the website. We've looked at it carefully. It says the Green Party will therefore use rationing to reduce the amounts of meat and dairy food.
I don't think rationing is going to be in our manifesto for the next 5 years. In fact, I'm certain it's not going to be. What we're going to be putting forward is how we make our food system more resilient. And we're living at a time when we see food prices and fuel prices going up and up. We're really in a vulnerable situation in the UK because we're not producing anywhere near enough of our food at home. And the farmers I speak to in Suffolk and Norfolk all the time say to me that there's far more that the government could be doing to support our farmers, to produce far more of our food locally, to improve the grants that are available for nature-friendly farming, where farmers tell me that there's nowhere near enough money in that pot, it's too difficult to access. So if we work with our farmers, we can produce far more of our food locally, we'll be far more resilient to a changing climate, to international political affairs, which, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, can shoot these prices up. And so Greens are alone in recognising we need a far more resilient approach to farming, to energy, to the way we run our economy. And that's the vision we're setting out.
And you have candidates standing around the country on that platform.
So that's his name is Adrian Ramsey. He's on Laura Koonsberg on Sunday from the Greens, talk about rationing meat and dairy. Martin, you actually on this show over the years have talked about, oh yes, rationing is coming, it's coming. The Green Party apparently agree with you, and one of the things that he didn't really answer there was that one of the reasons the farmers are protesting is because it's green policies that are meaning that they have to take land out of production, and so they're therefore even less able to afford to run their farms. And they're also facing the price fixing by supermarkets who aren't paying them anywhere near enough for the produce. So, meat and dairy rationing?
Well, I mean, what Laura Koonsberg is doing there is they've gone through the Green Party's, voluminous public discussions about this. She picks up on this one thing.
It's not a discussion, it's a policy document.
Yes, it's a policy document, but it hasn't been adopted yet. They're still discussing it, yeah? That's the whole point about a policy document. It's something we're talking about. Now, in actual fact, what may happen if we go to war with Russia is there's going to be rationing anyway. Not to do anything with Greens or anything to do with that. It's just because they're going to, like happened in World War II, they're going to be hitting ships bringing food in. Yeah? Just as we're going to be hitting their ships bringing food into Russia, except they don't have to bother about that because they've got loads of railways. The thing is, people say there is a massive crisis facing us, and it's not just a climate crisis. There's going to be a banking collapse. Lots of countries in the developing world are going to go...
You keep saying this.
When it happens, you will know it.
You've been saying it for 15 years.
Yes. It only happens once, Tony. And when it happens, it happens.
They get bailed out.
No, they don't necessarily get bailed out because you can only do that once.
Well, they haven't. They've done it several times.
Oh, yeah, but
they did it in 2019,
yeah, but they're now,
before COVID, and they did it in 2008.
They're now reaching a position where if they try to raise interest rates to control inflation, the banks collapse.
Who is
so
they can't.
The economic people, the people who run the economy, that is to say the central bankers and the bankers.
The City of London.
Yes, that's right.
Will not bail themselves out this time.
Well, they're not. You can do, there's things you can do, and they've done them, but you eventually run out of road. And they've run out of road. Not least because they didn't win the war in Russia, which they expected to win quickly, and then they were going to take over all the wealth in Siberia. But that's not going to happen. So they've priced that in, and they're not going to get it.
Do you feel like you just had no one to vote for? So the idea is, look, we're just going to have some of our own candidates here.
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of us do feel disenfranchised. I come from the far left. Back in the day I would have called myself a communist. I didn't approve of communists saying don't bother voting though. I think we should still vote, but I would have called myself a communist back in the day. I still call myself a pragmatic communist. If there was such a thing as a communist government in the Western world, I would be supporting it. However, there isn't anybody in the Uni Party that I feel I can vote for. No. So I'm looking at the smaller parties. Now, if Party of Women were not actually standing in Bristol, I would probably vote for the Trade Union Socialist Party. I haven't... I'm far left.
You're not keen on George Galloway, then?
I'm not sure. I don't know if he's voting standing in Bristol Central.
Well, I think they will be standing in Bristol. Like I say, we're at the point now where we just simply don't know who's going to be standing where. Tomorrow we will. There will the various electoral commissioner, I guess it is, will announce these are the candidates, people that have got their deposit in and got their signatures. But anyway, George Galloway is most definitely going to be standing some candidates in the southwest, probably at least one in Bristol. So let's have a listen to it. He actually did launch his campaign and their manifesto this week, and he had a lot to say about what he thinks is the beginning of the end of Keir Starmer. What he's talking about here, or at least he starts off by talking about, is Starmer's performance as and maybe we can hear from you two before we hear from George Galloway. He's absolutely convinced that Starmer can't think on his feet, Martin.
Well, I think compared to George Galloway, that's probably the case, because George Galloway is very much a kind of, street fighter. He doesn't need notes. He knows what his mind is. He can be buttonholed by aggressive journalists, and he just choose them to bits.
Yeah, and he says things like,
Starmer is not in that league.
Do you support the Prime Minister? I despise the Prime Minister. He comes out with these fantastic sound bites.
But he does it without notes. It's all there.
Starmer he speaks from the heart. He's like a rock star that never sold out.
Yeah, well, Starmer is very wooden in the way he talks. But of course, the pitch he's making is, I am not the crazy Tories over there who are having a nervous breakdown and don't know what, to tie their own shoelaces.
Anyway,
and that's actually quite a good, from his point of view, that's a reasonable thing to do.
Stella, you get the chance to hear from George first, Stella, before we hear your thoughts on him launching his campaign this week. The beginning of the end of the Starmer Labour Party. That's what he thinks is going on right now. As the campaign progresses for the general election, Starmer is going to start doing worse and worse. Actually, the polls say the opposite. But let's listen to George Galloway now.
The public in Hackney and Stoke Newington, just like the public now in Chingford, have risen up against them. That's the start of Keir Starmer's election campaign. And I'm going to tell you something, you might not want to hear it. I see these people every day up close and personal. When it comes down to one-to-one debates, Rishi Sunak is going to knock spots off Keir Starmer. He's a much better debater. Keir Starmer's a block of wood. I saw birds trying to nest in him just the other day on the campaign trail. He's clunky. He can't think on his feet. He needs a barrister's brief in order to bore the judge to death. Well, you can't do that in a general election. You've got to be nimble. Jack, be nimble. Jack, be quick. Jack, jump over that candlestick. Keir Starmer would trip over the candlestick. In fact, he placed the candlestick down there so he could trip over it. This man is accident prone. And he's going to be found out when the general election hones in on which of these two people will be the Prime Minister. Now, some of you are thinking, well, surely we want Sunak out. Nobody wants that any more than I do, trust me. You remember his reaction when I won the by-election. He flew an RAF plane down from Lossiemouth in the dark, got out a lectern that was too big for him, because he's very, very small, trust me. He's even smaller than you think he is. He wears elevator heels. I used to think that was a kind of Hollywood thing. But he literally has elevated heels. That's how small he is. But he's still far more effective in close quarter fighting than Keir Starmer will ever be. And some of you will say, well, isn't this about the lesser of two evils? Labour, Tory, same old story, two cheeks of the same. And I say this, if you vote for the lesser of two evils, evil always wins. And nothing ever gets better. But in this case, again, some of you might not like this, I could not tell you which is the lesser of the two evils, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. They're both equally evil to me. And I don't know, if asked to choose between this cheek or that cheek of a that I have any preference. I want to boot that hard on the 4th of July in the general election, because nothing good will come out of a Starmer victory or a Sunak victory, because they are indistinguishable on everything that matters. Whether it's the economy, whether it's society. This is Blair versus Blair, this election campaign. Sunak's a Blairite and Starmer is a Blairite. They have the same views on social, cultural and political issues. But I must move on to what the television wants me to talk about. Keir Starmer has a bigger problem even than the ginger growler herself. His biggest problem is that he has supported the worst genocidal massacre seen on earth since 1945. Seen. There have been others. Vietnam, which is where I came in, was even worse. Many times worse in quantum, but we didn't see it. Seeing is believing. There is nobody in this country who has wanted to can have avoided seeing the mass slaughter in Gaza. 2.3 million people trapped in a cage, being massacred by their jailers. And when they stand up, rise up against it, it's they who are the terrorists and not the guards who are raining down death and destruction, beheading their children, cutting the limbs off their mothers. Rivers of blood are running in Gaza, and Keir Starmer has supported it from the first day and until this day. And that is Keir Starmer's biggest problem. Because there are millions of people in this country of whom you are a mere snapshot. I make that point because most of the people in this audience are white English people. They try to tell you that the only people who care about beheaded children in Gaza are Muslims. That's a lie. All Muslims, of course, care about it. But millions of other British people care about it too.
So that's George Galloway, part of his speech. I'll put the full version of that up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. So there are some voices out there. Stella, what do you make of George there?
George, well, he's, we all know how long he's been around. He's a showman, he's an ideologue, he's bringing the Middle Eastern politics square into, to Britain with every candidate he supports. There will be people, and there will be Labour voters as well, who will vote for his party as a sort of protest party. Whether that will happen in Bristol, I don't know. They might be more willing to prop up the Greens to try and help the Greens win the seat. George Galloway is a very interesting character. He plays both ends against the middle very often. He's got showmanship. He's charming. He's when he was in the jungle.
So what do you mean by playing both ends against the middle?
Well, for example, bringing it back to our women's rights issue, he was actually brilliant on this at the Batley and Spen by-election. He was the only candidate who stood up in the town square and talked our issues against trans ideology for the protection of his own children, and he was brilliant, and he did it on the record. How he actually squares that with the oppression of women across the Arab world is just a mystery to a lot of us. So he's clearly aiming for both sides, if you like, of an argument there. He's a showman. He's a showman, and you just heard that speech there. I mean, he could stir up people quite easily. He's very clever. He's very good at it.
What do you think of his assertion he makes earlier in that clip there, though? That in fact, he says he does refer to it there. Is that Starmer is, because he is so wooden, that the election campaign is going to expose him. We've got another one of these TV debates tonight. Again, of course, Galloway is not invited. He will not. What they've done is they've got not the top 8 parties standing candidates in the election, but the top 7 parties. Yeah. So that's just one above the number that Galloway's allowed to be in the TV debate. And I mean, it seems to me he would make a massive difference and could make an enormous impact if he was in one of these TV debates, and he would get a lot of votes from it. And that's why the BBC has shut him out this evening. But this is the trickery that the media use. So I mean, what do you make of the media's playing an enormous role here, isn't it, in saying, well, you can hear from this one, but not from this one.
The media is also suppressing certain things they don't want to say. Even George Galloway hasn't said it. Why don't he come straight out and say it oh, because Starmer has a Jewish wife and they all go to the synagogue every weekend. Why doesn't he come right out and say that? He hasn't said that. He just says, oh, he's wooden. Oh, he's not a good debater against Rishi, little Rishi. This is all like, yeah, very, very clever.
Well, he might just decide that he doesn't want to make a religious issue of it. He'd much rather make it about the genocide rather than about the religion.
Well, that shows that he's a clever, very clever sort of orator, and I agree with you that he's a real character, and he could very well attract votes, but he's not going to attract them off Tories, is he? He's going to attract them from Labour, from Lib Dem voters, from Green voters, as a protest party.
How is this going to play out, Martin, with Reform now announcing that that Nigel Farage will actually be standing, even though he said he didn't want to? He's now been convinced. In fact, maybe it's just looking at the polls that the Reform Party have realised that Richard Tice, their leader, is nowhere near as popular as Farage is amongst voters.
I tell you, we'll be very, very unhappy about Farage's decision, and that's Rishi Sunak. Because in actual fact, he's had these various policy initiatives about bringing back national service and all the rest of it in order to try and win over these Brexit voting elderly voters, because they were moving towards reform. And of course, with Farage in charge, they will split the right-wing vote in this country. Now, if you know anything about rugby league, as I do, if you split the vote like that, you're going to be trashed. Yeah, Starmer will be very happy with Farage's decision, but of course Farage could still do what he did last time and then call the whole thing off in order to try and take over the Tory party.
The point is that they're not doing that this time.
He says he's not.
They are taking them
off.
He
says he's not.
They are taking
He said
them
that
off.
last time.
I agree with Martin. Him definitely agree with you. Yes, that is the trick they pulled. And if you look at the way the polls are falling at the moment, they had the Reform vote and the Tory vote together. What do you get? Almost equal to Labour. So they could pull this off again.
I don't think if you put the Tory vote and Reform vote together, it's not equal to Labour.
No, but it's moving. They're moving closer, and they will move closer.
In any other country, all these parties would exist. And in Spain, they had a very, very close election between the left and the right, and the left just about pipped it. But they had to keep all of their people together, and everybody has to be included.
Anyway, apparently Farage is going to make a big impact, according to one polling expert.
If all he does is simply to ensure that support for reform is not squeezed in the next 4 weeks, that in itself will be bad news for the Conservatives. Not least because what we have to remember here, this is in a sense, for those of us who remember the election 5 years ago, this has a remarkable sense of reverse déjà vu. 5 years ago, Nigel Farage announced he was pulling his Brexit Party candidates out of Conservative-held seats. And in the wake of that, support for the Brexit Party fell quite markedly, even in places where it was standing. Now he's doing the very opposite. And the problem for the Conservatives is that whatever share of the vote they get, that vote is above all going to rise most in Conservative-held seats, simply because the baseline is zero, because there wasn't a Brexit Party candidate there last time. And we can see the key message of YouGov's MRP polling. It was there in the local elections. It was there in previous MRP polling. It was there in last year's local elections. The Conservatives are losing support more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. And one of the reasons for that is indeed the fact that reform support, the rise in reform support, as compared with Brexit in 2019, is highest in Conservative-held seats.
Okay, so not quite sure who that was speaking on LBC, but the point is that it looks as if this is, Stella, they're going to make an enormous dent in the Tory vote, reform.
Yes, they think they are. I'm not sure whether that will happen here in Bristol, because it isn't a fight with the Tories here in Bristol. So whatever candidate they've got here may just be a paper candidate.
Yes, but the thing is, it will do in most of these constituencies. It will flip it over to the other Uniparty, Labour. So it's not going to make much difference, really.
Yeah, I can't really see, unless he pulls off the same stroke they did with the Brexit Party. I can't really see them making much of a difference, and I'd be surprised if they even he might win Clapton, I suppose, but I don't think they'll win anything else. The
big story, I think, this week anyway, when it comes to the final piece we're going to do now on the general election, is the Conservatives, how badly they're doing, and there's some enormous predictions about just how a tiny number of MPs they're going to end up with, and that's with Rishi Sunak at the helm.
We've had 3 polls out tonight, all showing pretty substantial real gains by reform, all showing the Labour Party down a bit. Just give us your overall impression of the story they tell.
Yes, Andrew. What we're seeing is the first evidence that Nigel Farage's big decision at the beginning of this week is going to have a substantial impact on this election campaign. All three of these showing increases in reform from between 4 or 7%. Reform in the averages are now polling not too far away from where UKIP were in 2015. These polls do show Labour down a bit. I'm not really sure there's any evidence that that's directly related. Much of what we know from other sources of data suggests that the Conservatives are the most exposed to this reform challenge. And given how far the tide has gone out for them generally, this is a big, big problem. And it's particularly a big, big problem because in hundreds of Conservative seats, there were no Brexit Party candidates in 2019, and there will be Reform UK candidates this time. That is thousands of votes off hundreds of Conservative MPs' majorities before they lose a single vote to Labour or the Liberal Democrats. It is, in no uncertain terms, Rishi Sunak's and Isaac Levido's worst nightmare.
And it's very hard not to get overexcited or overimpressed by some of these numbers, because the Redfield and Wilton poll, for instance, which shows the Conservatives on 19 and Labour on 42 and Reform on 17, would actually give the Tory party just 40 seats in the next Parliament, behind the Liberal Democrats on 63. So the Conservatives would not even be the official opposition. Now, I kind of find that hard to believe, but maybe I'm just too conventional, too naive.
Well, I mean, it can be argued either way, and as an academic, I can argue it either way with you. On the one hand, a new party like Reform, will it really deliver this level of support at the ballot box? There's still lots of question marks about that. UKIP didn't deliver in the end on their best polling, so let's wait and see. On the other hand, if those numbers are correct, if that's what we see on election night, first past the post is brutal to any party once it falls below a certain threshold. If the Conservatives fall to 20, if they fall to 18, if they fall to 17, they lose everywhere. That's how our system works. You don't get anything for second place under our system. So you can very easily go from 360 seats to 50. Let's not forget what happened to the Canadian Conservatives in 1993, when they went from a majority in their parliament to just 2 seats. That's the kind of thing that can happen under our system if you fall far enough.
Either of you like to predict how many Tories we're going to end up with in Westminster? Certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be many.
I spoke to a long-time Labour member today. He's older than me, and he's been obviously watching politics all his life as well. He's predicting that Labour will have a majority, roughly what the Tories have got now, and that's from he's hearing that from inside the Labour Party.
Yeah. Well, I think that's quite likely. I mean, obviously the Reform splitting their vote is devastating for them to first past the post. If it was, if this was Spain, it wouldn't matter. Vox can have more far right than the popular, what's it called, the PP. But at the same time, the vote isn't split. They have to negotiate with each other, but it isn't split. But in first past the post, it's brutal, as you were saying. If you fall below a certain level, then, and of course the other thing that's happened is a bandwagon effect, where when people realise that they're going to lose, they desert them because they think, well, we might as well vote somebody else because we're not going to win.
This is what I think makes first past the post so fascinating. I know you hate it, Martin. In fact, I do hate it too. It was interesting hearing from Jungle Bus Millie a few months ago just how much many activists in Holland despise their first past the post system they've got. And they say, we'd love to have proportional system, that they would love to have a first past the post because it means the strong politics that where you actually vote for something and actually something might actually change, as it very rarely does apparently in Holland. Anyway, I'm going to give the final word before the break to you, Stella. What would you say? I mean, you're a tiny little party. Most people will look at you on the ballot paper and they'll say, well, what's this about? I'm going to have to vote for one of the big parties in first past the post, otherwise I waste my vote.
I think you'll find that nowadays there's a lot of people that will vote for protest parties, and a lot of our campaigning is online, YouTube and things like that, which we're not in mainstream media as much as other parties are, but then we're reaching another demographic, aren't we? So I think we have every chance of people turning to us as protests, as Reform do, as the Workers' Party do, as any of the other small parties do.
And I can remember when we had a ballot in the Journalists' Union for an editor for our magazine, the only woman candidate won. mainly because all the women voted for her.
Well, who knows what
anyway.
people are going to do in the privacy of the voting booth, and that is the great thing about our secret voting.
Okay, Stella Perrett, thanks very much for joining us.
All and Silas bound in jail had no one to go their bail. Keep your hands on the plow. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hands on the plow. Hold on. Freedom's name is a mighty sweet. Soon one day I'm afraid we're going to meet. Keep your hands on that plow. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hands on that plow. Hold on. Got my hands upon the God's
So that's actually Bob Pegg and Carol Pegg, Mr. Fox there. A couple of tracks from, I think it's from the album Mr. Fox and the Gypsy. These are from 1970-71 time. The reason I played those this week is I just had a few days up in the Dales. And there are still folk clubs up there in pubs once a week, places like Keighley, Skipton, that sort of place. It's nice to hear that there is still a little bit of folk music going on. When I was at college back in the 1980s, early 80s, we used to go up every once in a while, pile in the car and go to the folk clubs and often hear some just terrific musicians. There's always a few not so good, but they had a terrific tradition in the Yorkshire Dales of keeping the a kind of blend of traditional songs and original artists going live music in pubs. So nice to hear that that's still happening. So yeah, Mr. Fox there at the beginning was Keep Your Hand on That Plough. Montgomery Gospel Trio. So welcome back to Not the BCFM Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. We are streaming live on various different platforms. The easiest way to find it, if you want to pick up the live stream at any point, is at talkradio.org.uk. So we're going to start this week, Martin, the part 2, by looking at this D-Day celebration and also the Dieppe business, which happened 2 years before it, in 1942. Well, it was actually, I think, 23 months before. So what can you say about that? They call it a celebration. I just looked at it as a kind of a carnival. It was just, it was awful, really. I mean, it was a travesty of proper understanding of what was going on during D-Day. Yes, obviously many people lost their lives. Lots of lovely old fellas that managed to survive it, and their comrades died by their sides. But there was and in fact, I was speaking during the week to a former soldier yesterday who said, well, when they did all this ceremonial with the king, etc., in Normandy yesterday, it was, what about the Russians? The Russians lost something like 50 times more people than the Brits, and yet they didn't even get a mention. Instead, you had that quisling Zelensky there, sitting there in with it. So it looks to me as if this is a total insult to those that died on D-Day, and now the Nazi mantle has been taken up by some of those who were stood there yesterday, trying to make this celebration a very Orwellian event.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you. Of course, a few years ago, as the crisis in Ukraine was developing after 2014, Putin came to the Normandy, not celebrations, commemorations. That's what the official title of it is. And he was able to chat with the then French president and the German chancellor, and arrange that we need peace talks convened in Minsk to try and solve the problem in the Ukraine. And it was called the Normandy Four, and it was going to be between Germany, France, the Ukrainians, and the Donbass rebels, with the Russians as as guarantors. So the discussion was supposed to be between the Donbass rebels and the Ukrainians, with the Germans, the French, and the Russians as guarantors of the discussions. And so that was the road to peace. And of course it was able to happen because Putin, as president of Russia, would be invited to the Normandy celebrations. Of course they weren't done. That didn't happen during the Cold War. Similarly, of course, the Russians didn't used to invite the West to their May the 9th celebrate. That was a celebration because it was a victory celebration, yeah? You commemorate battles, you celebrate victory. But anyway, it's a very sad sign of our times that the Normandy commemoration this year brings us very unpleasant taste to the mouth, not only because the Russians aren't there. You can understand, given the state of international politics, that might be a bit iffy and difficult to organise, but for Zelensky to be there, he didn't have to be invited. The Ukrainian nationalist parties, which he represents, fought on the German side in Operation Bagration, because of course D-Day was at the same time as a massive offensive by the Red Army, Operation Bagration, which was far more bloody than D-Day. And D-Day itself, in fact, was not as bloody as the battles of the Falaise Gap and the other battles going into Germany. In fact, they got ashore relatively unscathed. So a lot of this stuff is misremembered deliberately.
Yeah. Well, this is what bothers me, is it's supposed to be remembrance, but they're not. They're misremembering. And what they're doing is they're trying to spin history.
The past.
Yeah, trying to spin history to suit their own modern warmongering, effectively. So you got Dunkirk, didn't you, in June 1940. Then in August 1942, you got what was Dieppe, yep. And then you got Normandy another 2 years later in June 1944. So let's start with the Dunkirk withdrawal from from Europe. I know you've said this a long time ago, Martin. I don't know if you've said it recently for recent listeners, but there is this idea that maybe the Nazis actually let the British escape at Dunkirk, that they could have made a real mess of the British Army as they were trying to leave, because they had air superiority. The Luftwaffe were dominating the skies at the time, and they could easily have bombed the British as they left.
Well, they did bomb them as they left, but they could have cut them off and refused to let them go. You know, they could have sealed them into the pocket so you can't get to the beaches. But anyway, that is an issue, and historians are still arguing over that, whether in actual fact the Germans just took the foot off the pedal, or whether in fact they just didn't have the wherewithal to just prevent the evacuation.
Yeah, I mean, my own view, if for what it's worth, is that they had decided that they wanted at least to try and make peace with the Brits. There was this thing, they wanted to use this as a bargaining tool, saying, well, look, you know, we've let you go. We haven't killed anywhere near as many people as we could at Dunkirk, so here is a bargaining chip. Yeah. And they were hoping to bargain with that, but it didn't happen. Anyway, here's Winston Churchill's speech at the time, where he talks about the Battle of Britain is about to start, which of course was the air war, which was fought from bases like where I used to work at Biggin Hill in Kent, with the British fighters trying to stop the Nazis coming over to blitz the British airfields, and of course London too.
Freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands. Not one jot or tittle do we recede. Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians have joined their causes to our own. All these shall be restored. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Yeah, so Winston Churchill speaking in June 1940 at Dunkirk, Martin.
Well, not at Dunkirk.
About Dunkirk, right. To the new dark age he talks about. Well, it's almost as if that new dark age is back.
Well, I think the problems we're facing now as a human species are every bit as drastic as in that era.
But from the same small group of people, a similar small group of people who've hijacked much of politics and the military, the arms trade and finance. There's the same lot, really.
Well, I think, you and I have done plenty of discussion and research about the links between the Nazi Party and the Western financial institutions and the elite in the West. And no doubt we'll come to discuss this when it comes to Dieppe, for example, and the dirty deals that have been done behind the scenes between the Nazis and the intelligence services of the
What did he mean by
Western
perverted
powers.
science?
Well, what he's talking about there is the Dark Ages. If you think about it historically, the Romans were a fairly sophisticated civilization. In the Dark Ages, the people stopped writing. They stopped making pottery. It was a much less technically sophisticated follow-on. Whereas what you've got with potential of Nazi rule of Europe was you would have a barbarian philosophy, very similar to Odin worship, if you like, and the Nazis were quite clear in their admiration for Norse mythology and all the rest of it, but with nuclear weapons and gas chambers, tanks, aeroplanes and all the rest of it. So unlike the Saxons, who just had their scrammer sacks to kill people with, these people have got all this weaponry.
Well, I wonder whether he's also referring to eugenics, perverted science.
Well, I mean, it's a phrase which obviously can be interpreted in various ways, and he's not extrapolated what he means by that, has he?
No, but I think it's an interesting phrase to have used. Back in 1940, of course, Britain effectively won the Battle of Britain. We did manage to produce enough aircraft to get at least some form of defence going to stop so many of these Nazi bombers coming over to bomb British cities like Bristol, London, etc., and many others. And so there was something left of Britain after that, and of course the Russians had. It was in the intervening year, wasn't it, that in 1941 that Barbarossa happened and that Hitler did a surprise attack on the Russians. In fact, the Soviet Union, as it was at the time under Stalin.
That's right, and of course, as Alex Craner has pointed out, the run-up to that, the Munich Agreement, the Soviet Union had said, we will defend Czechoslovakia. We will send our army to Czechoslovakia to face off with the Nazis. The Western powers were unwilling to accept that, and the Poles were unwilling to accept the transition across their territory. And they, in fact, the Polish government of the time, then took a chunk out of Czechoslovakia as it was partitioned, and the Russians then decided to do a deal with Hitler, which of course they took a lot of flack for, because everybody else is. They then did a deal with Hitler and took a chunk of Poland. But from the Soviet point of view, taking that chunk of Poland meant that the Germans had further to come onto to their heartland territory. And if they hadn't taken that chunk of Poland, the Germans would have been further forward and probably would have conquered Moscow. Yeah. So the Russians are just thinking in terms of self-interest. We've offered to fight the Germans with you. You don't want to know about that, right? Well, we're going to do a deal with them. And of course,
it's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact,
which of course is very much remembered with hatred in Poland, because they just felt they were being sacrificed there.
Well, I mean, there were many countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland that were just rolled over, and I wonder, in a Third World War, Britain might just be one of those, mightn't it?
Well, I think we are sleepwalking into a direct confrontation with modern Russia, and of course they are a superpower. We are a minor European country. We're not in a position.
We are nuclear armed, but do we actually have control over these submarine-launched nuclear weapons?
Putin was hinting in his speech in I think it was in Uzbekistan this week. He said, "Look, lots of European countries who are saying they're going to send troops to fight us. They're quite small countries with a very concentrated population. If we do have a nuclear war, what may happen is we will nuke a small European country to make our point. And do you think the Americans are going to incinerate their cities to save your cities?" And the answer is they're not.
What do you mean by that? They're going to allow the Russians to incinerate American cities?
Yeah, no, because what the Russians will do, they won't necessarily make a direct attack on the Americans. They'll attack some of America's allies, and then that puts the Americans in a position, do we want to be nuked as well? Okay, now I'm not saying I approve of this, but this is the way things are going. And no doubt we're going to hear from Paul Craig Roberts or whatever in a minute. He used to be one of Reagan's economic advisors, but it's now he's critical of Putin, Paul Craig Roberts, because he says he's too weak. So I often discount what he says, because I think you're a Yank and you don't know what the Russians are thinking.
Well, one thing we do know is that they are thinking of some sort of retaliation, potentially, for the NATO countries taking out these 3 radars that we heard about last week. These are ballistic
which hasn't been reported in the mainstream media at all.
Very little reporting of it. No, there's a little bit in Newsweek. Let's be fair, Newsweek have reported it. There's a little bit on Yahoo News, but it's got nowhere near the gravity it deserves when you consider that it's a provocation to nuclear war.
That's right, but of course everybody switching on their evening TV in Russia have been told this, look what they're doing, what we're going to do about it.
So going back to World War II, so the Russians have been invaded, the Soviet Union's been invaded by Nazi Germany in late 1941, the same time roughly as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, both supposedly surprise attacks. So then we come along to the 1942, where the Russians are saying to the Americans and to the British, who are now by this time both very much in the war, what are you going to do in Europe? Are you going to do anything? Why was it the Russians were so annoyed? Stalin was specifically so annoyed with Churchill, saying, "Come on, we're fighting the Germans on our own. We've been doing it for a year now. When are you going to join the fight?"
Well, there was obviously big tension about it, and of course the left in Britain at the time were calling for Second Front now. That was the demand of the Communist Party of Great Britain of the time. But of course they'd been nonplussed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So, you know, everybody was all at sixes and sevens on all of this. There were actually logistical issues with mounting an amphibious attack on the main part of Europe. It's not straightforward to organise something like that. It takes a lot of effort. And of course, the other thing that Churchill was pushing for was let's work in the Mediterranean, so we'll work from North Africa up Italy, yeah, rather than coming through France. So they weren't even concentrating on just one front. Correct.
They were thinking, well, let's come from a different direction. But so the Stalin and the Soviets were understandably rather dismayed that they were having to fight this war in Europe on their own for quite a while. In 1942. This Dieppe raid took place in August, and so I'm going to quote now from this book by Milton Schulman, the memoirs of Milton Schulman. It's called Marilyn, Hitler and Me, and there's a whole chapter about the writing of the book Op JB, Martin Bormann and the Nazi Gold, it's called. Chapter 4 of this book published by Andre Deutsch in 1998. He was somebody that did a lot of work in getting the book Op JB published in London in the 1990s. So the headline of this chapter in Milton Schulman's book is "Am instructed to find Martin Bormann or go to the Palladium. 40 years on, Crichton's mysterious claims unfold. Nazi Gold and Ian Fleming's plot. Is Bormann dead or is there a double? Convincing the publishers. Doubt and death threats. The conspiracy theory." So Milton Schulman, Martin, was working with John Ainsworth Davis, Christopher Crichton is his pen name, to try and get this book published, and having all sorts of trouble.
Well, you can imagine, because what that book, which is a very important book because it's got a lot of evidence in it, is that the British intelligence services were in communication with Martin Bormann for quite a long time, and they were discussing with him how the war was going to end and who was going to be, you know, how it was all going to play out. And of course, if people haven't read the book, what eventually happens is a Royal Navy team, which was an international team, it had Jewish, German people involved in it, for example, because they spoke German, went in to Berlin at the very end of the war and extracted Martin Bormann so that he could then he was then sent to South America, and that a certain section of the Nazi elite were protected by the Western intelligence services as were the extreme right in the Ukraine, for example, because they were seen as a potential way of sabotaging the Soviet Union. And of course the war against the Soviets didn't begin after World War I ended. World War II ended. It had already begun, according to Christopher Crichton, because the British were negotiating with Bormann at earlier stages of the war. The book itself needs to be read, as does Paul Manning's book, Martin Bormann in Exile, because he was the top US correspondent in Britain during the war. This is all evidentiary stuff. It's all there. In actual fact, there was dirty deals being done.
Yeah, well, with these two books, one by a top journalist for CBS, it was really his swan song getting that book published. The publisher, son, I think it was, his son had his legs broken, and there was a big attack on the publisher of Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Terrific read. And what with when the OCJB book was published, this was by a British agent, and it's not just a silly book. It's got letters attesting to the truth of it, both by Winston Churchill and by Montgomery, published in the book in the little glossy black and white photo section. But anyway, he goes into Dieppe because the idea was that Dieppe was going to, if it was a success, it was going to convince Stalin that yes, the British and the Americans were serious about opening up the Western Front, wasn't it? But it ended up being a total failure, didn't it?
It did, and obviously they eventually went in on beaches rather than trying to take a harbour. Yeah, because it's a harbour, Dieppe, obviously. But of course, the other real problem was that Christopher Crichton, John Ainsworth Davies, was on the top of the cliffs with Rommel at Dieppe because he'd given them, pretending to be a British traitor. Yeah, he'd given them full information about what was going to happen. And of course, Crichton said this is the worst moment of my life when I watched all these Canadians being mashed up by the Germans who were ready for them on information that I had given to the Germans, so that the Germans would then trust him as a traitor.
He was embedding his cover as a double agent, wasn't he?
Embedding his cover as a double agent.
So anyway, I'll just quote from Milton Schulman in this excellent chapter in his own memoirs about getting this book OCJB published. He says, a third questionable exploit described in some detail by Crichton, aka John Ainsworth Davies, in OCJB, was the role he was given by Desmond Morton, that's Winston Churchill's private secretary, to establish himself as a British traitor in the eyes of Admiral Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, who was known to have anti-Hitler sentiments. The Russians and the Americans were pressing for a cross-channel invasion of northern France in 1942, but Churchill thought such an onslaught against the Atlantic Wall would be suicidal. He had plans for an attack on the underbelly of Europe in the eastern Mediterranean in 1943. What was that Torch ended up being, Martin?
Well, sure. that ended up being Torch, yes, which was the invasion of French-occupied Algeria.
Yeah, so the Dieppe raid used Canadian troops as the sacrificial lambs to prove how futile such a cross-channel invasion would be. So the idea is that we're sending a message to the Soviets saying, well, we did try, but it didn't work. But that was all deliberate because the Abwehr had been told before the Dieppe troops, the Canadian troops, turned up that morning. So to make sure Dieppe was a failure, although it was assumed the losses would be relatively minimal, Crichton was sent to meet Canaris in Berlin and tell him of the coming raid. In the process, he would establish himself as a useful British defector whom Canaris could trust because of the accuracy of his information about Dieppe. Crichton claims it authenticated him as a British traitor, but he never knew whether the information he provided about Dieppe was passed on to the commander of the garrison, improving the impregnability of the Atlantic Wall and postponing Overlord for almost 2 years. That was D-Day. So Dieppe achieved its purpose, but at the cost of over 3,000 men, mostly Canadians, killed, wounded or captured in an action lasting just over 9 hours. So that's just quoting from it's called the Chapter 4, Martin Bormann and the Nazi Gold, in the book Marilyn, Hitler and Me, the Memoirs of Milton Schulman, published in 1998.
Yeah, well, it's quite a while since I read OCJB, but I understand that Crichton was actually at Dieppe when it came in, because he said I had to watch these people being killed, and it was.
It may be. I think it may well be that Milton Schulman didn't actually know that, because OCJB.
Well, I think what he said was that if it had turned out that he double crossed the Germans, they were ready to shoot him and throw him over the cliff, but it turned out that they hadn't. But he said he sort of looked at Rommel, and Rommel was just smelled a rat with the whole thing. But at the same time, it's hard to imagine that the British intelligence services would sacrifice 3,000 of their own soldiers in order to implant a spy in the Nazi leadership. Yeah. But that's the level of deception. I mean, that goes on in warfare, I'm afraid. It's not just this war, it's what goes on
anyway,
all the time.
So John Ainsworth Davies had managed to convince Desmond Morton, the Germans, that this guy was genuine. He didn't get shot on the cliffs and thrown over the cliffs because the Dieppe raiders did turn up. And it sent a very clear message to Stalin, didn't it? Well, we had a go, Martin. We had a go, but I'm afraid we failed.
Yes, and of course the other thing is that why Churchill was more interested in the Eastern Mediterranean rather than attacking from the south of England is all of the British colonies in the Mediterranean. You know, we don't want to lose those. You know, that's a very important part of our empire, and we'd rather have the fight down there than have it up here. The Americans were pushing for an immediate attack across the Channel. So it was the British who said, no, let's not do that, that's a bit risky. So there was a double reason for them to want Dieppe to fail, yeah? And also to have the Canadians be the fall guys, because they're all, because they contend the Americans were much more difficult than you think, blah, blah, blah.
So they're playing God in a similar way that they did with the ultra decrypts, and they knew there were raids coming into a city, but they didn't tell people in the city to get into their shelters, because they knew that the Nazis might start to think, well, they can read our messages.
That's right, and that's in a way that's the kind of normal deception you would expect in war. But of course, the denouement in Op JB is that Crichton goes back with a team into Berlin, a special boat squadron type team. So they're using canoes because it's it's lots of canals and culverts in Berlin. So you can creep into Berlin in the sewers basically. And then they extracted Martin Bormann and took him out. And they even took somebody with them who had the same teeth as Martin Bormann, because they'd had dentistry, and his job was to be shot, and that's Martin Bormann committing suicide. But the real Martin Bormann was actually taken away and eventually sent to South America, where at one stage he wanted to talk to Paul Manning because he was on his deathbed, but the people around him in the organisation that he ran didn't want him to talk. Because, of course, Bormann on that stage had reached the point he wanted to boast about how he'd escaped and how he'd resurrected the Third Reich. See, this is what's so important about this, is the infiltration of very senior Nazis into the NATO intelligence structure from the get-go. But we already knew this because Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the Gestapo, and also, I think it was either Abwehr or Gestapo, but he had all these agents inside Soviet Russia. He becomes the head of the BND, the German intelligence service, West German intelligence services. Now, the Russians can read this. So the guy who used to be in charge of all the spying inside the Soviet Union now becomes the head of the West German intelligence services, ex-Nazi spy. He's the head of your intelligence services. And of course, Stepan Bandera, who was protected by the West, eventually they got him out of there, and he was in Germany, and of course he was assassinated by the KGB in Munich in 1959, because of course he was a brutal killer. He killed thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, Poles,
you've talked
Ukrainians.
about the intelligence and the military aspects of this. The reason Bormann was captured and brought back by John Ainsworth Davis, Ian Fleming and the rest, described in...
Ian Fleming was involved in this, of course, listeners.
Op JB.
Op JB is Operation James Bond, which is why he called his hero of his fictional books James Bond.
And it's also interesting, isn't it?
That was the code name of the operation.
In the James Bond books, you get M, don't you? And who was the mastermind of this operation? Desmond Morton, Churchill's private secretary. So that could easily be M being the boss. And this was an interesting part of MI6. It wasn't funded by the Ministry of Defence. It was funded directly by King George VI, by the royal family. So it was a separate section to MI6 that organised all this. And of course, the big thing, Martin, which I think we haven't quite touched on yet, but it's so important, is this financial empire. Yeah. Bormann was the signatory to the bank accounts for all of the loot
where all the money was
of Nazi Germany. Most of it was in Switzerland. Much of it was in South America. And so he was the guy. He was the main man to, if you've got the money, we can do deals. So the idea is give all these guys, new identity, total protection, even though Ladislas Farrago did get a photograph of someone that looks extremely like Bormann, in Buenos Aires in the 1970s, still alive. The idea is we're going to give them complete protection and they can get on with their mafia-y business empire, a kind of financial Fourth Reich after the war.
Well, Crichton himself was promised that they were going to get access to all of this money so that it could be given back to the people the Nazis had stole it from, which of course was utterly naive. And he himself felt completely betrayed, because of course what happened is all this money stayed in the hands of this Nazi infrastructure, which then started to cooperate with the CIA and MI6 in Latin America and elsewhere. So in other words, the Russians and the Soviets before them were not at all paranoid to think that the fascists were still embedded in the Western structure.
This is the point.
Because they were.
This is the point, isn't it? That now everything is now turned on the old Soviet Empire onto Russia. So there were characters like General Patton at the time, weren't there, that was saying, right, well, let's just get together with the Germans and attack Russia now. That's in 1945.
Well, Churchill was in favour when it was clear that the US had nuclear weapons. He said, well, why don't we attack the Russians now with nuclear weapons before they get them?
Operation Unthinkable.
And it was discussed. And of course, you can imagine from the Soviet-Russian side, they're extremely paranoid about this. You've got fascists embedded in your infrastructure. You've got a new weapon which you can destroy cities with a flick of a switch. They were, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And it's quite clear to modern Russians, who are quite educated, sophisticated, cosmopolitan people, that they've always been in the sights of the West as a problem. Yeah. We can't possibly cooperate with you because, you're not going to do as we say.
The Russians, or the Soviets, just after the World War II, were the most vociferous protesters about, where's Bormann? Where's he gone?
Of course, they said he's dead. Because they had a body, which was supposedly Bormann.
Well, no, hang on. That wasn't discovered until the 1970s, that body. There was no body.
Yeah.
There was a Nuremberg trial for Martin Bormann, but he was apparently in absentia. No one could find him.
Well,
the Russians, for many
years,
years,
he was actually in the courtroom at the back.
That's right, it does. But for decades, the Soviets were saying, where is Bormann? Why has he disappeared? Where has he gone? And so, we've now uncovered and discovered that. So anyway, let's just wind this little section up with listening to Keir Starmer at the D-Day celebrations, or at least talking about these D-Day celebrations this week.
The security and defence of our nation is personal to my family. Like so many families, I have relatives who served in the Second World War. My mum's brother, my Uncle Roger, served in the Falklands on HMS Antelope. And I remember the terrible wait when his ship was bombed. My mum's fear as she sat by the radio every day listening for news. And then the relief, a long week later, when we found out that he'd survived. So I know the courage, the service, the sacrifice that allows us to sleep soundly at night from our forces and their families. I know it, I respect it, and I will serve it with every decision. It is part of my story, and the reason why I said from day one of my leadership that the Labour Party had to change. Change for a purpose, to respect your service, face the future in this dangerous world, and above all, to keep Britain safe. That is why, with my changed Labour Party, national security will always come first. That's the message I took to Kyiv last year when I visited President Zelensky. A pledge of unwavering British support in the face of Russian tyranny. But we have to be resolute, not just in our support for Ukraine, but also, in this era, at home. We must face down malign actors who try to attack and weaken our nation. And not just through traditional warfare over air, land and sea, but with hybrid threats to our energy supply, cyber security, information warfare. Now, I would prefer if politics were kept out of this issue, even at this election. Throughout the whole of this Parliament, I have deliberately not been partisan over issues of national security. Yet just before this election, the Tories questioned this Labour Party's commitment to national security. And I will not let that stand. The people of Britain need to know that their leaders will keep them safe, and we will.
So that's Sir Keir Starmer soon to be Prime Minister, by all accounts. He's really there saying that this is the same fight against countries like China, against Iran and Russia that was taking place in World War II, that his relatives died in.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Or were fighting it anyway.
We could discuss this in terms of electoral calculations in Britain, where, of course, he's trying to get away from the sort of... Jeremy Corbyn, he wants peace, but I'm Keir Starmer and I want war. This is the line he's taking.
What he's saying is we're going to have to face these guys down sooner or later. Let's take them on.
Yes, and of course, what's really delusionary about it is the stuff about the Ukraine. You feel like saying, what do you know about what's been going on in the Ukraine, Keir? Did you know about the fact that the massacre in the Maidan Square in 2014 was carried out by a NATO death squad from Georgia? And we know this because there was a court case in Kyiv where the name of the US commander of that death squad, Christopher Boyenga, even came into the court case. He's a lawyer. He ought to know this. He ought to know who bombed Bologna railway station in 1980. It was NATO, because that's what the Supreme Court in Italy concluded.
He can't say anything without a barrister's brief in front of him.
Well, I mean, the thing is that he's flagging up to the powers that be in the British deep state, in MI6 and the CIA, you can rely on me. So there's not even a question about perhaps we should spend
Isn't that what this is about? Money and NATO. They want us to spend more on defence.
Yes, that's right. And of course that money will be spent in the United States.
On American weapons.
On American weapons. Right. Now, the thing is, he's making a virtue out of the fact that he's going to be an American pawn, because he's trying to live down that terrible period when Corbyn was threatening to sort of negotiate peace in Ukraine and not support the Israelis. And of course, Starmer is the candidate. He's the war candidate. As is Rishi Sunak, of course. They all are.
I would say even more so Starmer, because he's got behind him these other war candidates. That's Mandelson, Blair and Campbell. Well, these people are very much advising Starmer. They're very much involved.
Yeah, well, they are. And of course, what's missing from a Labour point of view is, why did you think we lost power after you invaded Iraq? It's because people basically lost faith in the Labour Party's moral compass.
It seems to me Campbell, Mandelson and Blair are a safe pair of hands for World War III.
Well, they are. This is the thing. Of course, he's trying to give the image there of being a safe sort of dad who will look after you and make sure that you don't get into any trouble. But in actual fact, they're walking, with blindfolds on into a direct confrontation with the Russian Federation over a war that was started by NATO, because the massacres in 2014 were carried out by NATO and then by the Ukrainians in the Donbass, which then provoked a reaction.
To be fair, Martin, you did say that. But anyway, Spain is to join South Africa's genocide case against Israel. Al Jazeera have got a report on that, and that's interesting because maybe it doesn't look as if the Bilderbergers convinced them not to do that last weekend. They seem to have done it, although Bilderberg and their meeting last week that we covered they seem very focused on getting tension going with the Russians and possibly provoking the Russians to hit some NATO power rather than just Ukraine, as they hit the NATO targets over in Russia. Scott Ritter, though, Martin, we mentioned briefly earlier, had his passport taken off of him this week. He was going to a St. Petersburg financial conference. Can you say?
St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which isn't just about economics. Because economics is related to all sorts of other things.
This is like a sort of BRICS G7 or something, is it?
Yeah, it's just another meeting, but of course the West used to attend, but they've been told not to now. So it's basically the Russians with everybody else. There's some people from Africa, Asia. I mean, if you want to do business with Russia, you come along to this yearly thing and go hand and find out who you need to talk to.
Anyway, this is a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, the guy that arranged many of the treaties that took nuclear weapons down many pegs and let us sleep safer at night. Scott Ritter speaking about having his passport taken away this week to Judge Neapolitano.
Does Joe Biden, does Tony Blinken, does Rishi Sunak, does Emmanuel Macron, does Olaf Scholz, does Donald Tusk, President of Poland, do these folks understand the significance of what Foreign Minister Lavrov said, and that the Russians don't bluff?
No. If they did, they wouldn't
be going this far down this path. They are being advised by people who are saying that the Russians are bluffing, that the Russians lack the capacity to back these words up with meaningful force. There's even people who say, look, Russia's focused on the BRICS summit in October and, on bringing the non-aligned world together. Why would Russia risk, a war with the West? Well, because the West is threatening Russia's existential survival. And this is the danger. I mean, even President Putin came out today and said, this is a very dangerous game that's being played that will have fatal consequences for the United States. Judge, in retrospect, it might be a good thing that you and I didn't go to Russia, because I'm very fearful that while the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is underway, that a red line will be crossed and Russia will respond. And we will be looking at an outbreak of actual war between the United States and Russia. This is why I wanted to travel, because I was hopeful that by speaking to the Russian government, speaking to the Russian people, speaking to the Russian nation about the potential of the American people to do the right thing, come November, maybe vote in somebody who isn't hell-bent on going to war with Russia, that the Russians might not be inclined to act precipitously when we cross these red lines. But I was denied that opportunity by the U.S. government. And now, sadly, there's no voice in Russia right now, American voice, that can caution this. The U.S. embassy isn't. We don't have an American ambassador that's meeting with the Russians on a regular basis saying, this is all misunderstanding. What do we need to do to avoid war? We have a U.S. government together with NATO allies that think Russia's bluffing, and they are seeking to put as much pressure on Russia as possible prior to this peace summit that's being convened by Ukraine and Switzerland in the middle of this month, a peace summit that's falling apart before it even begins. But the operating notion is that we must convince Russia that we are serious about the consequences Russia will accrue if it continues military engagement against Ukraine, that Russia's only choice is to be compelled to the peace table. Russia's not playing that game. Russia's playing the game of, we've won this war, and if you want to make it a broader war, we'll win that war too.
Here's how serious Russia takes it. Here's another statement. This is a full screen. We don't have it on tape. From Foreign Minister Lavrov. I'll read it aloud for the benefit of those who are taking the show audio only. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on May 30th. We do not rule out additional steps in the sphere of nuclear deterrence because our command centers and the locations of our nuclear forces will be in range of American forward-based missiles. This is about as serious as you can get.
There's a lot of Americans out there, they're in the armchair warrior category, who are like, unleash the ATACMS. The ATACMS, of course, is the long-range, up to 300-kilometer range missile that we have provided to the Ukrainians. Ray McGovern, and next time you have Ray on, you can talk to him about this, has highlighted some of the negotiations are taking place between the Russians and the United States before the initiation of the special military operation. And the Russians kept saying, we can't let NATO into Ukraine because we can't allow American missiles into Ukraine, because a lot of these Russian facilities, command centers, et cetera, that Russia uses were conceptualized and constructed during the Soviet Union when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So from a Russian perspective, they were deep in the Russian rear, protected. But if Ukraine now is carved out, made part of NATO, and you insert American missiles there, all of these places that were thought to be safe in the rear are now reachable. And if America allows Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles to strike these facilities, Russia will nuke NATO, not Ukraine, NATO. And this is what Lavrov just said. If you do this, now, according to the Ukrainians, they're complaining that the United States will only allow them to use the HIMARS, that they won't be allowed to use the ATACMS to strike Russia yet. But just so everybody in your audience understands, we are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying. We are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying. The Russians aren't playing games here.
Well, when you hear it from somebody like that, he's a military man, and he's been involved in negotiations with the Russians about nuclear arms limitation going back to the 80s. He was also involved in the so-called weapons inspections in Iraq by the UN.
Yeah, he resigned, didn't he?
And he resigned in the end.
He said there aren't any weapons of mass destruction.
I hope that the Russians will realise that there's no percentage in nuclear
Isn't
war
this
for anybody.
boiling? The Russian is the frog. It's being boiled by NATO. At some point, they're bound to hit out.
They are, but they've got plenty of ways to hit out without blowing everything up. They need to calibrate what they're going to do.
Won't they be thinking maybe we're going to have to do something pretty damn strong and tough? Otherwise, they'll just ignore us.
That's right. I mean, what the West is presuming is that they can carry on provoking the Russians. And the Russians have showed great restraint, despite all the rubbish that's been said about how brutal and belligerent they are. They've basically bent over backwards to try and find off ramps at every stage of the game. Putin, in fact, in Russian political terms, is regarded as a moderate, and there's plenty of other people who are much more belligerent than he is, and they've got popular support. Don't think that the Russians watch our TV. They know what we think. We don't know what they think. This is the trouble. The sort of narcissism of the West, where everybody looks at, they're only looking at their own navel. Everybody else can hear what you're saying.
I don't know. There's a certain amount of narcissism coming from Russia too, because so much of their stuff is in Russian. It's not, they should be thinking to themselves, surely they should be thinking, well, we need to make sure this is in English.
Well, that's what RT was all about.
Something like 100 times more people will listen and understand
That's why RT International was in English, not Russian. But of course they've closed it down.
They're still putting out stuff in Russian. They're not putting out in lots of stuff that I see on various other channels, all sorts of stuff on Telegram and on WhatsApp. God knows is in Russian.
With modern basic technology.
In fact, the Russian channels that are on Telegram often is just Russian.
Well, I mean, anybody can get this stuff translated by just pressing a button on the computer. The real problem.
No, you can't do that.
All right. Well, anyway, it's not a question of
with the voices.
It's not. The Russians have given up on trying to influence Western public opinion, apart from in a marginal way. They were doing their best to try and talk.
You can still get RT, by the way, isn't it, on Rumble? You can watch it live anytime you want. Anyway, we're going to finish up this week with a guy called Dr. Gilbert Doctorow. I don't know if you've come across him before.
Yes, I have.
Martin,
he's a Russian expert American Russian expert based in Belgium.
And what he's talking about this week is what we should expect from Putin. He's studied this guy very well. He's also studied the Russians and their military tactics. This is what to expect.
All the tools at our disposal. No one should take that lightly or superficially. Dr. Doctorow, you are one of the world's foremost authorities on interpreting this man. How do you interpret what he just said?
I think it's unfortunate that he phrased his answer in that way, because he remains vague, and he's staying in the realm of a nuclear response to a non-nuclear threat. I don't believe that is the scenario that has much likelihood to happen. The question of a Russian response to an attack on critical infrastructure coming from Ukraine, being guided by American, British, or German or French manufacturers and experts of the equipment of the missiles that have been sent Russia's way. This can be read variously. I think that some of my peers and people who have appeared on your show, I think of Scott Ritter's presence 2 days ago, in which the assumption was that this challenge that is approved by Biden and approved by Sunak and by Macron can lead us straight to a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. In a communication this morning that it was on Sonar, Larry Johnson was saying the same thing. I'm not a subscriber to that. First of all, Mr. Putin is a very, very sober man. He is not a gambler. And even though I myself have written last week that Russia has a first strike capability in the sense that it could so damage America's nuclear potential that it would win on a first round, on reconsideration, I think that is highly improbable for a course of action by Russia led by Mr. Putin. What is much more likely, and I think his answer yesterday is a way hinting at the kind of response we can expect from Mr. Putin, although I don't agree that the first response will be to provide weapons to people in the Middle East. I think the first response would be to destroy Kiev. To knock out, to decapitate the government in Kiev, and possibly, after giving a sufficient warning of a day or two to get the civilians out, leveling the city. I think that is likely because there'll be no blowback. Nobody in Western Europe, not to mention the States, will shed a tear if Kiev disappears. If that doesn't solve the problem, and if there's still attacks coming from Ukrainian territory, supposedly by Ukrainian forces, the next step, and I'm not pulling this out of the air, it is a point that's been made on Russian talk shows, what they would like to see happen. They will demolish the Polish airport and logistical infrastructure that has been enabling the Ukrainians by serving as a go-between between U.S. deliveries and West European deliveries and further shipments into the Ukraine across the border. Again, looking at the situation, yes, you can say that would trigger Article 5. Well, to my knowledge, Article 5 does not require that the other countries respond. It just provides a framework for their responding. And I think it's hardly possible that anyone in Western Europe will give a damn if Poland is struck by Russian forces. And if that doesn't work, then the third in a sequence of responses would be to hit military bases and manufacturing facilities in Germany, England, and France. You'll note I'm excluding the possibility of a direct Russian attack on the continental United States with nuclear weapons. That is off script. Why? Because it's suicidal. Even if the Russians have this massive, very advanced strategic triad, there's still American weapons come from nuclear-powered submarines with appropriate cruise missiles. They would get through, and there would be massive losses of life in Russia. He is not a gambler. I think this is the scenario, or a scenario, that is more probable.
That is a very sober analysis. It's an endearing analysis because it gives us some cause for hope.
Well, he says cause for hope, but of course that's only because the United States won't be hit in that scenario. That's Dr. Gilbert Doctorow talking to Judge Neapolitano this week. Martin, what do you make of his what he's saying there about the potential for some sort of Russian strike back against the West, against NATO specifically, for taking out its ballistic missile defences, also for hitting its command centres, supposedly by Ukraine?
Well, I think that I don't think that my reading of Russian nuclear doctrine is that we don't mess around with tactical nuclear weapons. And in any case, for example, you've got some of these Israelis saying let's have a nuclear.
We're talking about hitting Polish airport, which is being used to bring munitions and things into Russia, isn't it? That's what he's saying.
Yes. So I'm just agreeing with him that we can rule out a Russian first strike, because it's suicidal for the reasons that he just said.
A nuclear first strike.
Nuclear first strike. No, but what they will do is, if the British have been told already, if I believe it is SAS soldiers fire these missiles at our bases inside Russia, we will fire back. And we'll obviously try and kill the people that have just fired at us. But of course, that's difficult to do because they move around. So that's why they don't fire from a fixed position. But of course, if they can identify the units involved, then they can hit their bases here in Britain. Because it only takes about less than 20 minutes for a Russian Kinzhal or a Iskander missile to fly. Now, the thing is, what will British air defence do if they see these missiles coming towards us? This is the real danger of nuclear war, is if we start to get a conventional fight between, let's say, Britain, because, of course, the Russians would be wise to just pick on one country, yeah? So that the Americans can have a think about whether they want to get involved in the fight. And I would pick Britain because they've been the most belligerent if I was the Russians. Yeah, pick on them. Yeah, give them a bloody nose and then they can make everybody else freak out. Yeah, that's what I'd do. I'm afraid that's the way I would think about it. And what you do is they could easily fire these missiles. Now, they can't shoot them down, yeah, because they're too fast. But what they could do is warn the British, as the Iranians did with the Israelis, we're going to hit your bases. Get your tin hats on and get down in your bunkers, because we're going to hit you directly. We're not on this occasion looking for maximum casualties. We're just showing you we can hit you right where you are. Not in the Ukraine, in Herefordshire, in Scotland, in London, if necessary. They could hit NATO headquarters in Brussels. They could say, right, you clear everybody out that headquarters.
That's the one that
shape.
It looks like the letters SS if you look at it from above, isn't it?
I think that's the one in the United States. I think, but anyway, I don't really
know. It's in Brussels, the NATO headquarters in Brussels. SS. Look at it from above.
Yes, okay. Well, the point is, if these missiles are used and presumably the targets are going to be Russian military bases, although some of them have just been used for random attacks on civilians. Yeah. That's what they've been used for. These high-tech weapons have been used to blow up bakeries in Belgorod. Yeah, that's what they're using them for.
Is that they're trying to get the Russians to negotiate by forcing them to the table to climb down and to do with Ukraine. But obviously the Russians are thinking, we're not having none of that. Do you think it's true to say that Russia's very existence is being threatened right now?
Well, look, if we're all facing a nuclear war, then all of our existence is being threatened, isn't it? I mean, they're not unreasonable to feel like that. And don't forget, this whole thing has been cooked up by the Western intelligence services. It's absolutely clear with hindsight. There was no intention to negotiate. Mitterrand and whoever it was, the German person, it wasn't Schulz, I can't remember who it was. They both said, well, we were basically lying when we negotiated. We always intended to take back the Donbass. And of course, do you remember when the Russians invaded? They said it was unprovoked. But in actual fact, they've been planning to invade the breakaway republics all along. And that's why the Russians preempted it, because they were just about to attack. And they've been shelling civilian areas in the breakaway republics for ages. In fact, loads of civilians have been killed by random fire by the Ukrainians. The Russians, in fact, have been fairly scrupulous about trying to avoid civilian casualties. And of course, you compare them to the Israelis in Gaza, they've been like Dixon and Doc Green, frankly. And of course, what will happen is if we hit a Russian military base or for example, one of these nuclear warning facilities, well, the obvious thing for them to do is hit exactly the same facility in Britain. Yeah. Yep, you've got military bases too. You've just fired a rocket at our military base. Some of our guys are dead. Bang! Some of your guys are dead. Now, the problem is that when we're using these conventional missiles to shoot at each other, you do not know whether it's got a nuclear warhead on. And therefore, you might be under the pressure, as these missiles are coming towards you, you might have to decide that is this going to be a nuclear attack or a conventional attack? Now, what the Iranians were able to do, because they haven't got nuclear weapons, is they told the Israelis, we're going to attack on such and such a day and we're going to attack these places. And they did. And there's nothing the Israelis could do about it. They spent billions of dollars trying to shoot down the incoming... And that was the Iranians just using a tiny, tiny piece of their arsenal. But the problem for nuclear-armed states is the F-16s, for example, are potentially nuclear-armed planes.
Yeah, the Russians have said that they'll just take them out as soon as they arrive on the scene.
Well, they're going to take out everything as soon as it arrives on the scene. They can't shoot in Poland at the moment, but if the Poles carry on beating their chests and demanding war with Russia, they might get what they wanted.
Yeah, well, some Poles. Most Poles don't want to do that, do they?
Well, the kind of Poles I used to hang around with definitely don't. But I'm afraid there are some Poles who are just blinded by their historical fight with Russia, that they're prepared to go. And of course, they're deluded that people in Britain and the United States feel as strongly about this as they do.
Yes,
and that's a delusion.
So much
we
of this
don't care.
Comes down to the psychological warfare in the press, doesn't it? That Starmer was referring to, except he was referring to it upside down. President Biden celebrated the deaths of Russian soldiers in Ukraine during his speech in Normandy, commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day. They've suffered tremendous losses, Russia. The numbers are staggering. 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded, he said. Nearly 1 million people have left Russia because they can no longer see a future in Russia, said President Biden. The real number of dead or wounded troops in the Ukraine war is unclear, since neither side shares information about casualties. It's likely Ukraine has suffered more casualties, since the conflict is largely an artillery war and Ukrainian forces have been significantly outgunned. So what do you make of Biden bragging about killing 350,000 Russians on D-Day?
Well, it's extremely poor taste on an occasion to commemorate the dead of a past battle, to talk about how successful we've been in a current battle. You know, these celebrations of remembrance should be solemn, and there should be a solemn attitude. To use them to make those kind of claims is in itself, inappropriate. But of course, it's also absurd. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians have been smashed completely by the Russians. The Russians haven't taken massive casualties. They don't send in human wave attacks. They're using their technological superiority to pulverise the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have got no air superiority or artillery superiority. And if they weren't being supported by NATO that had been defeated ages ago, they were going to go to the negotiating table in 2022, and then Boris Johnson turned up to tell them not to. And of course, he's had the Azov battalion in Parliament this week.
Last week,
even though he's not a member of Parliament.
Says Paul Craig Roberts, the West has placed the survival of the world in the hands of 3 artificial states. All of the trouble in the world revolves around 3 artificial states: Ukraine, Taiwan and Israel. Well, North Korea maybe a bit as well, but anyway. Ukraine was this is Paul Craig Roberts writing, Ukraine was part of Russia for longer than the United States has existed. It was first created as an independent country in the early 1990s by Washington following the Soviet government's collapse and replacement of the Communist Party with Yeltsin's rule, the puppet of Washington. Ukraine is thus an artificial country, merely 30 years old, having never previously existed as an independent state. Taiwan is a small island off the China coast, part of China, inhabited by Chinese people. Washington tried to pretend a small island was China and had Taiwan sitting on the UN Security Council, but President Nixon knew better. He supported the removal of Taiwan and its replacement with the Chinese mainland. Nixon originated the One China policy that has been US policy up until Biden. Israel was a creation of the stupid and corrupt British government, or perhaps more correctly of the fanatic Zionists who drove countless undefended Palestinians from their towns and villages. Generations of Palestinians have been born in refugee camps located in Jordan and Lebanon. The genocide of Palestine as a people and a country has been ongoing since 1947. Nothing's been done about it. Israel's gotten away with it simply by using the Holocaust card to gain sympathy for its victim status and paying Western politicians campaign contributions to support its agenda. Consider the fact these 3 totally artificial countries, totally lacking in any reality, are each capable of unleashing nuclear Armageddon. Ukraine can do it by continuing to use Western-supplied long-range missiles to attack Russia's early warning system. Taiwan can do it by accepting occupation by US soldiers and more shipments of US missiles. And Israel can do it by getting the bought and paid for Biden regime to OK Israel's attack on Iran. The question Paul Craig Roberts now proposes is, if in fact the US is a superpower and the West as a whole constitutes a mega superpower, how is it possible for 3 artificial states to have control of the West's future?
Well, he's obviously a former Reagan administration economic advisor who's actually repented of quite a lot of that era. These artificial states have been created by the Western deep state in order to hamstring Russia and China. And if the Western deep state wanted to make peace with Russia and China, the Ukrainians would have been told to stop fighting, the Israelis would have been told in no uncertain terms they've got to have a 2-state solution, and Taiwan would have been told you're never going to be independent, you've just got to suck it up. And the Russians and the Chinese would go, thank goodness for that, we're all on the same page. But they've used them as a means of antagonising their main opponents as they see it, the Russians and the Chinese. And of course this is a reckless course. It's an insult to the war dead of everybody's in World War II, because that was supposedly, we're not going to do things like this in that kind of way anymore. And the projection onto the Russians and Putin as being the new Hitler, it obviously creates a really, really
but who is it who's going around invading whoever they feel like and lobbing bombs into whoever they feel like Hitler was back in the 1930s and early 40s and right the way through to 1945, really. It's the NATO, it's the Western Empire.
Well, what's the the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation doing getting into a battle in the Hindu Kush, which they then spend 20 years killing people and lose? That's just doesn't make any sense at all, does it?
Scenario. Finally, Hong Kong arrests 3 people in intensifying crackdown on dissent. 3 people were arrested in Hong Kong after disrespecting China's national anthem. They are accused of turning their backs on the field or failing to rise during the anthem broadcast at a Soccer World Cup qualifier against Iran. South China Morning. This is your precious China, Martin. If you don't stand up, if you turn your back at an anthem, you're going to be arrested and jailed.
Yes, it's an authoritarian system, Tony, but it's not as authoritarian as in Saudi Arabia, where there is no elections of any kind, and you know, there's no pretense at any kind of democracy. But of course, Saudi Arabia is our ally, and we're happy for them to kill, murder, destroy.
To hear you talking about China as authoritarian. Right, time to sign off. Thanks to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, also to Shakir Yildirim and Stella Perrett. Also to sound engineer Dave Bazanko. You can download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like, and follow Tony Gosling Censored on Telegram. Do please send me interviews and story tips via Not the BCFM Politics Show page, where you'll find the podcast, the full-length interviews, story, in fact a very good one with George Galloway I think this week, story links, comment page, and our email addresses. You can subscribe also to my weekly newsletter and even donate at thisweekonword.org.uk. We are streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream, at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, DJ Plug Radio in Nuneaton, Warwickshire, and also live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. If you can restream this show live or rebroadcast us, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing and enjoyable weekend away from the empire of lies. That means switching off the news if you can. But do please join me for Not the BCFM Politics Show next Friday at 5. God bless, and don't let the satanic banksters get you down.
With hope in my heart and fire in my head, I set off to find where the gypsies had gone. I flagged down a car that dropped me at Bolton, the valley before me, the town at my back. Walking alone by the low hills of Wharfdale, by the black top of Kilsey, I saw the dawn crack. The first one I met on the road was a farmer. He nodded his head as he passed me by. I asked him politely if he'd seen the gypsies. They were camped up at Langstropdale, came his reply. By evening I came to the village of Bumpton, decided that here I should make my night stop. Have you seen the gypsies? I asked my friend Jackie. They've moved on, he said, they've gone over the top. So next morning I took the road into Wensleydale Mall, and before me stretched out like a dream, up by the boulders and over the bridge, where the white lady walks into the stream. I stopped an old man I'd met once before, Kit Calvert, the maker of Wensleydale cheese. And when I asked Kit if he'd seen the gypsies, the words that he spoke helped to put me at ease. He said the gypsies left early, I watched as they went. They had one among them, fine dark-haired lass. She shouted to me from the back of a wagon. They were making the Kelp by the Buttertubs Pass. Now the Buttertubs Pass, it's steep and it's high, and the horses would find it a hard way to go. If I kept on the road and my boots didn't fail me, I might catch them up before daylight was through. High on the road and nobody near me, far from the city and far from all harm. Sheep on the hillside, grouse in the heather, the blind windows of a far distant farm. and saw the wagons, and I knew that my journey was nearing its end. Mary walked up to me and I looked into her eyes, and the sadness in her face is a thing I can't describe. We didn't speak a word, there was nothing we could say about the closing of a love affair, the closing of a day. Mary took my hand in hers, I took her hand in mine. Just one more night together before we had our time. We couldn't sleep inside the van, there wasn't any room, so I spent the night in Mary's arms beneath the haloed moon. I woke up in the morning, the light was cold and grey. The gypsies and their caravans had gone upon their way. In my head a burning pain, in my heart a hole. By my side a note was pinned, have mercy on my soul. The last time I heard a word about my Mary Lee, she was married to a tinker and was living in Dundee. They say she has a baby now to bounce upon her knee, and I wonder in the long nights if she ever thinks of me. Well, my father was a shepherd, he kept sheep all on the hill. And my mama was a vixen that he found in the corner of a field. And they called me the wild man of the hills. And I was up all night, crouching on your windowsill, with my face pressed against the pane. Then I was off in the driving rain. I come down to the valley when the stars are in the sky, and I hunt around the farms and fields for things that run and fly. And they call me the wild man of the hills. I rob the hens from the coops and the whiskey from the stills. And then I'm off in the morning to you before the sound of the cock crow. Well, many times have they tried to track me with dogs and chains and guns. And many times have I wondered if it's them or me who runs. You know they can call me the wild man of the hills.